His name again means the war maker, or the power of war, the maker of war. So we have these characters. As mentioned last week, in terms of the narrative, Socrates is coerced to go see his old friend. He never visits Cephalus. He's coerced. He's kind of saying, Polemarchus says, we've got a gang here. You're not going to be able to persuade or wiggle your way out of this, Socrates. So really, this study of the political community really begins with a kind of enforced kidnapping. A kind of nice, pleasant kidnapping. You can go your way, Socrates, but you're going to have the shit kicked out of you if you do, because there are more of us. And he actually mentions that in both the Reeve and the Bloom translations. So you can see this kind of accostedness. However, Socrates, as being Socrates, comes to Cephalus's house, and they begin a discussion about how are things in old age. And again, the first perspective that we're taking here is the looking back, the reflective position from old age on what is justice. What does it mean to have a just life? And in terms of, Cephalus, he's really talking about being liberated from bodily pleasures, right? That he has enough money to pay his debts. He thinks he's lived a just life. And sort of like an elementary Socratic principle, he's saying that if you live your life justly, you will end up considered a just person and a happy person. In other words, in some ways, this is an elementary form, if you will, of Socrates' maxim: the unexamined life is not worth living. It's only the examined life. So, Socrates sort of begins there. Cephalus brings it up in terms of his own investigations. The first reduction, if you will, in terms of a definition, and again, this is a dialogue that is trying to define overarching what is justice and also what use does one profit from it. These are the two overarching questions of the dialogue. Cephalus, basically ends up with a definition that can be reduced. Justice is telling the truth and paying one's debts. That's what it means to have a just life. That you've lived as true as you can, both to yourself and in the ethical obligation to the social, to the community. And at the same time, you have also, basically paid all your obligations, made good on all your obligations. Socrates critiques this through the idea of a mad person. If the mad person borrows a weapon from you, then goes insane, is ready to go to kill someone, do you tell that person the truth? You're insane, I want this back. And do you also say, you are obligated to give it back to me? He uses this example as a way of undermining, this working definition. It's not so simple that justice is really just about, elementary correlation between acting the right way and paying one's paying one's debts. Yeah. So really, in a way, the correlative or the correspondence theory of truth is sort of demolished very early by Socrates. You do not correspond just act to justice in the end, right? In some ways, it's not a one-to-one kind of correspondence. He's making it much more complicated than this. And then, of course, the second definition that is proffered is justice is giving to each what they deserve, or to each what is owed, right? And this is extended by Polemarchus into doing good by one's friends, like Trump does until you're his enemy, and then doing harm to one's enemies, which he's very good at doing the minute they turn from being friends. Again, a very simplistic notion, because Socrates raises the question of, do friends always do good by you, right? And sometimes do enemies really help you out? And, these are things that become complicated by the ambiguity, and again, cannot be simple correspondence or correlative moments in terms of how one defines justice, right? Because we're dealing with levels of abstraction. We're not dealing with simplistic, descriptive terms or acts that we can correlate one-to-one. I hope you can keep that in mind, right? And Socrates constantly is going to ask for clarification, and he's going to ask as well, the questions about the language. He says, doing harm, what does that mean? Doing good, what does that mean? in terms of basically the context, if you will, of giving to each his due. In some ways, this is a kind of a democrat or meritocracy view. It's a kind of the position from meritocracy that each gets according to their abilities, right? In a sense, and should be rewarded as such. Each gets his due. So in some ways, there is a critique of what Plato calls the democracy early on in this prologue. That the meritocracy itself is not enough for justice. Yeah. So we can see this in terms of probably the level of argumentation that the certain Supreme Court candidates now have. They're not even close to the level of our BG, right? In a way, and I don't want to hold her higher than she deserves, but certainly in terms of legal, ability and acumen, she's in a different league than these people that the Republicans are putting up. It's really a question of levels of reading, interpretation, and of course orientation of the law and the interpretation of the Constitution. So anyway, I just use those examples in a way, again, as that the meritocracy for Socrates is not going to be the end all to be all here in terms of defining justice. And as I said last time, in a general sense, the general meta principle of justice here is that justice is an attempt to establish social harmony between the sources. We can call this psychic forces instead of the soul, right? But psychic forces and that of the social forces, right? How does one resolve that conflict and do so harmoniously? And justice for Plato, at least in the overarching sense, is defined at the meta level, once again, as justice is the harmony between the three levels of the soul and that of the social forces at work. And if that's upset, then we become, in William Barr's words, an anarchist jurisdiction. We become anarchic because we no longer have the harmony of the justice that is desired, right? The social forces are somehow amiss if there's too much conflict, etc., right? So you can begin to see, in some ways, Plato in the original is very conservative here, in terms of his thinking, as well as then justice. What is its use? Who does it really profit is the other question. What is justice's use in the formation of the political community? Who does it benefit? Who does it not benefit? So these are the questions that he's setting up and that we attempt to answer in the beginning. For Savalas, the use is, paying the obligations, being a truth sayer, very much like the later Foucault, the truth telling, the parousia, that he speaks of late in his notions of governmentality. On the other hand, the making good on obligations, being debt free, right? In some ways, both, I guess, morally, ethically, and and this whole thing, we could relate this, of course, to guilt, indebtedness, as the German word Schuld has. Guilt and debt are next to each other. And, one of the very best on this, again, I'll make some asides here, is Nietzsche and the Genealogy of Morals, especially how we come to the vocabulary of good and bad. Right? This is very important to consider. How do we get the noble base relations and what's going on there? And we can talk more about that because Nietzsche thinks about a kind of new aristocracy. And I think one of the critiques that radical aristocracy, one of the critiques of Badiou is that somehow he's moving towards some kind of aristocracy here. I'm not sure about that, but we can speak about this as we read more and open it up, and what would that mean? What does an aristocracy really mean going forward? As some of you probably know, the English Marxist school, such as J.D. Bernal in particular, really wanted science to be an aristocracy. They saw Marxism as a science. They saw Marxism as a leader vanguard that would really lead the people, and that you really needed an aristocratic class that is able to guide the planet, right? In a way that the communist movement, right, and its relationship to science was much better equipped to lead, towards a, social order and a new form of governing and new forms of distribution, etc. And really, in a sense, the speculation about utopia, to really go towards that kind of utopic moment. So this is something that has been in the tradition, and we can speak to that as well. There's been a lot of criticism of that, but J.D. Bernal, for those of you that don't know, wrote a book called Science and Social Action, was a metallurgist by practice, and was also the father of the famous Martin Bernal, who wrote Black Athena, which shook the academic world, and especially some of the Greek classics professors with the Afro-Asiatic roots of linguistics. So interesting how much of the Greek vocabulary had Semitic roots and influences, and especially Egyptian. So we again can go back to that. Anyway, to go back to this dialogue. So the first two, for the first two definitions, justice is speaking the truth and paying one's debts, and justice is giving to each what is deserved, or what is due one, and also doing good to one's friends and to one's enemies, are basically once again taken apart by Socrates. And I read you, I think it's important, I'm going to refer somewhat to the text. Badiou has a very nice summation of this on page, I think it's page 13. And excuse me if there's too much light, but I have a strong light here. I need to see. So on page 13 in the prologue, Badiou ends with his critique, the critique of, again, of Polymarchus. And I'll read it out loud. It's page 13 of the Badiou, the prologue, and this is in the text 327, or really 336b, because Badiou is trying to follow along the original Plato as well. He says, if anyone, even Simonides, even Homer, claims that justice amounts to giving everyone what's due him, and this is, again, Polymarchus's position and definition, and if his underlying thought is that the just man should harm his enemies and help his friends, we will boldly argue that such remarks are unworthy of a wise man, because, quite simply, they're untrue. The truth, it appeared to us, in all its glory as the dialogue went on, is that it's never just to do harm. The fact that from Simonides to Nietzsche, by way of de Sade and many others, the opposite has been maintained by the poets or thinkers, the maxim, and this is very important, it is just to harm one's enemies and to help one's friends, strikes me as something that could have been said by the Xeres, right? By the Alexanders, the Hannibals, the Napoleons, and even the Hitlers. That is, by all those in whom a sort of intoxication was caused for a time by the enormous scope of their power. Okay, so this is very important, right, in a way. I think Badiou sees this, this will to power. And I want to mention, too, a text that I think everybody should read very carefully, especially during our times, is the section Juliet, Enlightenment or Morality, in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the third essay in the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, written in 1944, published in 47, right? The Dialectic of Enlightenment, that's that section. Very important to read that on morality and this whole notion of justice as doing good to one's friends, instead of that justice, is also doing harm, and what that would mean, as we go forward. So really, again, what Socrates is pointing out, it's not so simple, right? It's not so simple as we go forward. It's much more difficult to begin to look at these layers, etc. The link, I guess we could find the link, someone, Bob, Dialectic of Enlightenment, by Max Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno. They wrote this while near Hollywood in Pacific Palisades, when they were in exile, among many others, neighbors being Bertolt Brecht and Thomas Mann, and that cast of characters, quite a cast, right? Yeah. Anyway, I think we should do some like it hot part two with the Frankfurt School. It would be fun to do that. Yeah, we could have fun here. I'm all for having some comedic. We need a Marxist Aristophanes. Yeah. So anyway, okay. So I want you to see this too, because this is where we are left in the prologue, so to speak. This kind of critique. That not necessarily true that the just do good, right? Right, etc. Right? Okay. So then we're going to go on to the major character, at least in my mind. We've had the argument from the position of old age, if you will, senior, whatever you want to call it, the elder statespeople, whatever you want to say, in Cephalus. The argument from the position of timocracy or meritocracy from Polymarchus, and now all of a sudden the wild beast emerges. And you already know that he's springing forth. Thrasymachus is like a wild boar. I think he's described somewhat like a wild boar, that he comes out of nowhere, right, in a way. He's hunched over at the table, and he kind of springs forth. Much like Foucault does with Chomsky, in a way. You can see Foucault, kind of like curling up and then kind of pouncing. It's interesting to see this in terms of the body language. But anyway, so Thrasymachus is new on the scene and is the character that confronts Socrates right away. What pathetic hogwash, Badiou says, right? And in the earlier translations, it's here we go, Socrates. How easy it is just to ask questions. It's much more difficult to give answers. So right away, he's throwing Socrates off, right? In many ways. And I want you to realize three things about Socrates, in terms of method. The chief method here, in Socrates' case, as he leads on, is Socratic ignorance. I want you to, again, this is something that is a strategy that he uses. It's a very difficult position to engage completely, but I think that you should see this, that the Socratic ignorance is a strategy in which he's going to say, look, I know that I don't know.
Right.
Please tell me what you know, right? But I am wiser than you because I am aware of my ignorance, and you're not. You're arrogant, thinking that you do know, and therefore I'm much wiser. So this is the original position of, quote, wisdom in the Platonic dialogue. You actually admit ignorance first. You're ignorant of process, definition, and what something is. This is very important to keep in mind. He uses this strategy constantly, and as you know, probably the begging the question, you already know the answer, but you keep begging the question in order to lead the discussion on. That's one of his other strategies within this logic of ignorance, right? In a way. The problem with all this, and I think Thrasymachus brings this up, Socrates, how the hell, can you say you know nothing about justice, but you can argue, about it? You can tear down everybody else's definition. You must have some sense of it, right? So this is kind of the ongoing paradox. Socrates says, I live the examined life. Well, how does he know what the examined life is if he's so ignorant, right? Or is he just, always in the middle of the paradox or in the middle of this ignorance, right? Very much like the therapist, tell me more about what happened in the dream, etc. And other forms of interrogation. We don't know. We're asking leading questions here. So this is an interrogative strategy, this ignorance, right? Secondly of all, I want to say he's also using irony constantly. Yeah. Irony is another very crucial part of his weaponry. His arsenal of argumentation and leading the questioning. The ironia, is the irony. There are many, many levels to the irony. The first, of course, being able to reverse positions almost completely, right? that you have, a kind of reversal that goes on. You're also staying away from exact meaning, right? You're really playing upon ambiguity. Again, I recommend a book. I mean, I think we're in a position in the world right now where we don't really read well. And a great book is William Epson's The Seven Types of Ambiguity.
Yeah.
It's a great book that part of the older quote generation read with some aplomb back in the day. But it really tells us a lot about levels of irony and levels of ambiguity, etc. So anyway, irony is also has an intention to deceive at times. That's what it literally means. And this is what Thrasymachus, going back to this character, is trying to critique in Socrates. This intention to deceive, to confuse, right? And as I mentioned, Socrates has another category, I'll enter the third, is the maieutic, right? His mother was a midwife, a practicing midwife. His father was a stonemason. This is someone that came out of people that actually, worked with their hands, right? Were very, very practically oriented people. They had techne, they were artisan culture in a lot of ways. So all to say this notion of that Thrasymachus comes up with that he's deceiving, he's trying to confuse all the time, is something that is put out right away. And irony has, for those of you that read the contemporary theory and the last 30, 40 years, has dissimulation. It has pretense, right? It always is a means used sometimes to confuse an opponent in an argument, to use the ironic in a way. I have a friend that calls me every morning with the morning comedy from the newspapers. We're astonished to learn that, so-and-so Paul Manafort was running billions of dollars in money laundering for corporations and shell companies across the world. So you begin to get this kind of thing, this dissimulation, pretense, etc., but at the same time, this irony that goes on, right? Irony is also lying. So again, this telling the truth as part of a definition of justice, again, is lying, and I again refer to Nietzsche here, who is, in my opinion, absolutely brilliant on these matters, on truth and lying in the ultra-moral sense. This is a very, very important essay that people should read, on truth and lying in the ultra-moral sense, in which Nietzsche begins to look at language beyond that of just quote-unquote the correspondence theory of truth, correlative, one-to-one, correspondences of how we come to truth, or just even relational truth or relativist truth. So he's very, very good at taking this up. So anyway, the interesting thing about irony, and Bruno will appreciate this, it's both the is and the is not, that's going on, right? Irony also speaks to what is said both is and is what not is meant, right? It has that kind of, again, level of ambiguity about it and needs to be undone. And Socrates is really a master of this. This is really a master. If we get anything from him, we do get this mastery of being able to say what something is and then what it isn't, almost in the same breath, and simultaneously. So it's very, very, very interesting in this regard. So the irony, both is dissimulation, distantiation, right? Pretense, the ignorance that can be feigned, going back to his level of argument by ignorance, or the plea of ignorance, as well as ultimately Socrates as the midwife. What Socrates is referred to as the stingray. This goes on in the Meno in particular. He is thought of as the stingray. The idea here in his case, and again, this is one of the reasons I'm kind of prefacing what Thrasymachus is doing. The pretext here is that Socrates, as the stingray, called the stingray, is really interested in shifting the discourse making the discourse much more profound outside of the traditional, ways of going about something, the traditional ways of questioning, of interrogation, too. So there's a numbness that is created where the terms begin to change, where the meaning begins to change. And this is what they mean by calling him the torpedo fish or the stingray. You numb the opponent to the point of where that space becomes opened, where the birth of a new idea, or in better terms, the invention of a new concept begins to come through. So this is what he's really doing. He's really the myotician, if you will, of giving birth to a concept, to create that space for that birth. I mean, any questions about this? I want you to be aware of these three, consistent strategies: the plea of ignorance, Socratic ignorance, the meiotic form of inquiry, and of course the use of irony. And hopefully we can pick up on this in the text, because at one level, the reading exercise is very important here too, to see the subtleties, right? It goes beyond our usual Facebook, we hate Trump, it's going to be a, anarchist jurisdiction on the streets because of the case of Breonna Taylor today, etc. A lot of these things are very predictable at this point, that are going on. We have to think beyond that, if we're going to build, if we're going to use text like this. I consider this very important, this, notion of trying to think through a new political community.
I started.
Yeah, please, Richard. Yeah.
No, yeah. I started to hear it. That I know that I know nothing in a way I hadn't heard it before, which is that to as if a little bit like Odysseus, who to escape the Cyclops says, "My name is no one," and then the Cyclops, asks when he's blinded. The other Cyclops say, who did it? And he says, no one. They all ignore him. But that nothing is something to know, like to know nothing, that it's a positive thing. Because, I was thinking about these Greek words, and, they're really not necessarily at first blush incredibly stable in the way that Socrates kind of goes at them. Like even the word justice in Homer, and they're all tremendously familiar with Homer.
Right.
And, kind of means the customary way of doing things. It's much more like Thrasymachus. It's like whoever's in power gets to say what that is. But he really kind of is finding something which is not just etymology. It's really there's a substantial quality to nothing. It's like, and I'm thinking about this about negation and where negation goes later on with Hegel and Lacan and such. But I started for the first time to see that ignorance is really being, having a different, I started sensing it in a way I hadn't before.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I'll just go back to a sense of, the original use of the word justice in Greek, I think, is dike. Yeah.
Right.
Delta, iota, kappa, epsilon. Right. The goddess of justice. And as Bruno was here, who's very good on the pre-Socratics, knows, we get this ordering principle, an ordering of justice in a certain way, out of Anaxagoras and out of Anaximander, out of the fragments, that the pre-Socratics begin to give us these principles of order, right? That is very interesting on the cosmological level, right? That become part of the, quote, ethical order as we get to Socrates. So this is very interesting, the way, as you said, from Homer to Plato, the way justice comes down, right? In a sense, right? There's no longer this allusion, if you will, allusion to the extra worldly, right? Only in terms of justice, right? But again, we have, and we're going to speak about this more as we get more into Plato. I mean, what does Badiou mean by democratic materialism when we begin to talk about what is the idealism here in the abstract forms? Because what Plato is doing is he's setting up a very deep abstraction here, a very deep abstraction, right? What is justice? So we have to, be careful. But Bruno, you want to say anything about this? I mean, I'm just kind of looking back because, this notion of justice that we kind of, in some ways we have our own definitions of it, has a very long history that goes from, the pre-Socratics, all the way up to the ordering principles of Plato, and then, of course, Aristotle. For you, those of you interested in the Greek concepts of justice, Aristotle in Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and of course in the Politics, but Book 5 is where he defines justice in general and justice in its specificity. And it seems to me that Marx and Marxism, at one level, is very much still within the retributive justice, right, reparative justice that Aristotle speaks to in Book 5. But yeah, Bruno, you want to say a couple
Yeah,
of
no, but
things
what you
just to get
say, I mean,
the
of course, the
conversation?
pre-Socratics, I mean, Unexamined that you mentioned, of course, that's probably the beginning, no? At the
Yeah,
cosmic level of this idea of, right, justice, the things precisely, right, go back into whatever they came from, right, because of justice, because it's a matter of justice, right? That so that's the cosmic level, as you say, and then, of course, with Socrates and Plato, there is this shift in the ethical, political level. And of course, Parmenides too,
yes,
right? Parmenides also is interested in that. And they are also what Richard, in a sense, was saying, the question of nothing. Well, I mean, that's of course, a very big question, but I agree the substantial value of importance of nothing, which, if I may, also, just in a completely different tradition, but according to the axial theory, Jasper's axial, right, age of where philosophy started in many areas of the world. In Lao Tzu, in the Taoist tradition, we find the same idea of the importance of a relative nothing, right? I mean, this, right. So this is important too, and it has to do with the question of justice as well. I mean, then the way in which it is done here, of course, that's very interesting. Another, if I may, another remark that I want, that this seems, in a sense, to weaken Aristotle's critique of Plato in ethics, right? Because the question of the good, I mean, here it seems that really the question of justice has to be appreciated according to various situations, right? I mean, the question of a craft, techne, that you also mentioned before.
yes.
I mean, it's not simply the just person per se who is able to accomplish things, but not the person who has the specific techne, right? So all these things become important. I mean, they become important precisely in the confrontation between Socrates / Plato and the sophists in general.
Right, and Thrasymachus in particular here, because Socrates will critique the argument of justice as power. And the one critique that's interesting from the liberal perspective is that if justice is defined only as the advantage of the strong, that the ruling class only acts in its interest all the time, that is not necessarily the case. Does the ruling class act in its best interest in terms of oil, fracking? Does it act in its best interest in terms of, the greenhouse emissions, climate change? Is it
In
acting in
terms of
its best interest, etc.? So he asks this question too, going forward. Okay, wait, I'm hearing a lot of echoes. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, if I may, because I mean, Socrates agrees to a degree, with Thrasymachus, because it is a question of advantage, which is also the position, if you will, of Spinoza. So what he calls into question is this precisely idea of the strongest,
Yes.
what is that? That's what he really then ultimately calls into question. And that's very interesting too, because then this, in a sense, Socrates, this is a well-known fact, in a sense, he's the best sophist after all, right? I mean, but so he's not completely in disagreement with the idea, right, that is also, I mean, the question is, what is this, what is it to have power, ultimately, right? It goes back to the question of power, as you were saying also, with Foucault, but I mean, we know with Foucault, power is not simply somewhere in one place only, right? So, I mean, the question is what it is to be also strong. What is it to be the
Yes.
strongest? Right, okay, so
We're the children here. It's good. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
We're not in book 5 yet, Eloy.
okay.
We're the children. But anyway, it's good to see the family. La familia. Yeah. 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 Hi. Yeah. So okay, let's go back to this. The question sort of on the table, it seems to me to be with Thrasymachus, which is the longest part, both of the prologue, and we can talk about this. Badiou calls his chapter on Thrasymachus, which is again the prologue extended, silencing the sophist, right? What does this mean to the dialogue, this silencing the sophist? What does it mean to censor this kind of approach, right? What does it mean to censor, this Thrasymachus definition of justice is, first of all, in the interest of the strong, and then is the advantage of the strong. So both interest and advantage we're playing with too here. Class interest and class advantage together, right? So he's going on. What do you guys see as the stakes here? Because I think this is very important. Because in Plato's book, The Self, Thrasymachus does not reappear in the argument. He's kind of left out of the dialogue until the very end, where he reappears sort of as a defeated, member of the community, right? Who goes his way back to the northern part of Greece, to Salonika. So what's happening here, and why would Badiou call it silencing the sophist? Since he's rewriting this for our time, again from a position of a very radical position, if you will. I think, yeah, yeah. Any thoughts about this? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Jurisprudence. Basically, the question of what is the law is the same question. Is it what actually occurs? Is it what cops actually do, judges actually do, lawyers actually do? Or is it what it's supposed to be, what's on the books? Is it supposed to be just? What is the law is the closest modern equivalent I have to this issue, and it works with my students who get it. Is what good does it do to describe or prescribe, right? Thrasymachus is describing, cynical realities. That's important for us to do good or to do justice, is to be aware of what's really going on. It seems pretty accurate sociologically. But is that actually enough for a definition? Is that enough to say that that is what justice is? What is the definition?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, again, yeah, you point to, the intention of, again, Plato through the mouthpiece of Socrates and in the dialogue to obtain a universal definition of justice. Remember, this is an attempt by Plato to form the new political community. He's in the similar situation that we're in a way, after the Spartan Wars. Athens is a mess. He wants to bring together a very defensive Politeia, right? That ultimately takes care of everything against all invaders, and at the same time builds from within in a very orderly way. So he's faced with this is his project, if you will. This is the craft of the philosophical imagination, and philosophical acumen to build a political community in the midst of multiple defeats by one's neighbor, one's aggressive neighbor, etc. How to defend and also how to go on. So this is the situation that he's faced. Yeah, Richard. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, it reminds me in Thucydides of the Melian dialogue, where the Athenians basically, I think, shocked Thucydides, the historian, by making the argument their opponents, the Athenians, are vastly more powerful than their opponents, and the opponents make an argument based on principles, and the Athenians say, look, asshole, we've got the power, you do what we tell you to do. That's justice. Justice is, what is it? Those who have there's a saying, if those who have guns, if you have a shovel, you dig, and the gun, it's kind of that real power. But in a way, it doesn't, I remember Bruno talking about Sun Tzu, or the idea is it doesn't necessarily inspire people. In other words, they eventually lose. The Athenians, win a battle but lose the war in a sense. In other words, you were talking about do the powerful always do what's in their best interest? And even in Athens, I think the story of the Peloponnesian Wars, which is contemporary, is that they, they're tragically, that power blinds them, literally tragically blinds them, and causes their own destruction.
Okay.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about Plato, that he really obfuscates history almost completely into a philosophical principle. The connection with Thucydides is really interesting, because there you can see that the Greek state is exactly what Thrasymachus says it is. It's whoever has the power rules. And Plato really isn't interested in the historical reality of what's going on. In fact, I think he wants to eliminate that, because what Michael said before, he's going to construct a state that no longer has oppositions between different classes of people.
Right. Again, this is an attempt, I think you have a very good point, Robert. This is really a desire for unity. It's really about unity of the classes, right? In a sense, all on the same page under the meta principle, if you will, of justice. And this is why he is attempting this universal, definition. What can we unify everybody under? And the reason to go back to, say, Anaximander and Anaxagoras is that they talk about proportion. They're about measure in some ways, too. They're about proportion. And Plato also, as you said, he's obfuscating maybe the historical and the social by using philosophical principles. What principle is really working here is this harmony, which again is a principle of proportion, bringing things together. How do we create a symmetrical relationship between the aspects of the soul or the psyche, and in this case, the appetitive, the spiritual, and the rational, with that of the social conflicts out there. And and again, we could think of our own situation in terms of the Freudian principles of the id, the ego, and the superego. How does this work in terms of the social forces going on out there too? How do we begin to use this? This would be a psychoanalytic, version of history, if you will. That's really much based on a kind of Platonic investigation. Okay, Eloy, you had your hand up, and then Andrew. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I'm trying to. You need to unmute. Yeah. You need to unmute.
There we go. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, thank you.
Go. Okay, thank you.
Well, just I was just I have to confess that I was quite fascinated by the reading yeah, yesterday and today. It was really, really fascinating. And one of the things that I fascinate me, and correct me please if I am wrong, because I'm just learning. I
There's
just
no
know that
right
I
and
don't
wrong
know.
in philosophy. It's
So
just
there is
obfuscation and
there is
clarity.
there is this idea of justice in Socrates as how do we know that a thing is just? Um, is when we do right, we do good, right? And at the end of the conversation, and the chapter one is called the notebook one, I think. Um, there is this idea that, and how do we know that? And I think I got that the idea is we know that something is right, is just, when that is being done is affirming life. And I think when he puts the example of the doctor who's taking care of the sick, of the legislators who legislate to protect the subjects, and the people representatives who do for protecting it, we know that is right because it is those acts are an affirmation of life. And I think that what I got is that. Truth reveals injustice, and justice only manifests when an act is an affirmation of life.
Well, I mean, that fits
Now,
with.
now, now, my question is,
Okay, sure. Okay.
what it means to know nothing in that context, in which Socrates was saying, I know nothing, but at the end he was through asking questions, elaborating the new truth, these ideas about justice rebels when we do good, and we know that we do good when we are affirming life, we are affirming the life of the community, of the others. What it means to know nothing in that context is really an existential disposition to learn with the other, or it is a posture. There's a question.
Okay. No, that's a good question to hold open. I just want to refer. I think what you're, the textual reference to where you're speaking, I think, is when they begin to discuss the good in itself and the good in its consequences. And this is the second chapter of the Republic, in which Glaucon and Adimantus are speaking to Socrates. Okay, Andrew, and then Jerome. Okay, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, just a quick question,
yeah.
referencing something that I heard you say, Michael, around Plato's attempt to construct a new political orientation for it, or a community, let's say. Did you say that Plato is looking to a unity of classes?
Yeah.
And my question is, if so,
Harmony would be probably a better word.
a harmony of
Harmony
classes.
between classes.
I
Yeah.
mean, and then the question to me that just kind of screams, maybe
Yeah.
on a very basic level, is justice possible in a society that's divided by class? And is a harmony of class even something that's kind of worthwhile pursuing? Harmony of classes, if there's a
Well, I mean, I
differentiation of
think you're
classes.
raising a question that Althusser was extremely good on. Will their ideology remain after the revolution? Yeah. Or does class remain after the revolution? I mean, of course it does. It's going to go on, right? It's not that justice is the elimination only. The struggle is class struggle, of course, in Marx, right? The struggle for equality, but that's a very long, journey, a long march, if you will, to put it in a Maoist metaphor, But anyway, yes, I mean, Plato is not really talking about class conflict as such. He is more interested in terms of building this city-state, right? This protected defensive fortress on the level of having harmony between the classes. That's what justice does. That's its function
So
in
he's speaking to
society.
then, so if I understand you, he's
Yeah.
speaking to his goal is is a viable state more than anything else.
Yes. That's political community equals the Greek state in some ways. Yes. Yeah.
And I just wonder, again, kind of going back to Karatani, the implication is, in some sense, the idea of the state is actually, a primary impediment to a just world. The idea of the preservation of class and classes makes justice impossible. I mean,
well, I mean, look, you raise very important questions that are very active, again, in the history of argument and that goes on the left. I mean, will state power be lost? Should there be dual power? All these kind of questions are certainly operative, in terms of a transition. What does the transition look like, et cetera, et cetera? Because I mean, I don't think anybody just wants complete chaos and that the die will fall that way, right? That's kind of the issue here in a way. What role does justice play as we go forward? I want to go to Jerome. He's been having his hand up for a while. I'll come back to what you said. Yeah, yeah.
So I just wanted about justice and what is just, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
The thing that strikes me about Plato, and this does remind me of Aristotle,
Okay.
is when he defines why a doctor is good.
Right.
It's because the doctor practiced the skill as perfectly as possible, or as Badiou said, a skill considered in itself obviously has no particular interest except to be as perfect as possible.
Right.
And this is what's applied to ruling, to medicine, to everything, right?
Right.
And this is something in our time we only associate with aesthetics. You practice art for its own sake. And so it's almost like for things to work according to this dialogue, the roles of society need to be practiced like arts.
Yes, I mean you raise a really good point here. I mean, going back.
And this, before they get into morals, harmony, anything,
right.
The call is you have to be an artist.
Right.
That's what you have to be. I mean, in our language,
Right. No, I think you bring up something very, very, very essential here, and going back to the ancient Greek arete, which literally comes from Achilles the warrior, and also means skill in military battle, etc., becomes the first principle. The first principle of excellence is being able to fight, to be a warrior, right? This is the first principle. This is what excellence, unfortunately, we translate this word with too much Christian emphasis. We use virtue, right? It's the virtues that go on. Alistair McIntyre writes a book about after virtue, the Aristotelian, English Aristotelian. So, yeah, in some ways you raise a very good point about techne and arete, excellence and craft, and that somehow the statecraft is missing here, right, in a way, and where we are. Yeah, please continue, Jerome.
The other thing,
back to Andrew. Yeah.
The harmony between the soul and the social.
Yes.
If you're doing something for its own sake, it satisfies the social. I mean, the soul, while satisfying the social.
Right.
And you lose that if you're just doing it for money, let's say.
Right. I mean, I think the interesting thing is how we could extend, if you will. I mean, it's in a very basic, fundamental way. But if you look at the appetitive soul is really constructed by consumer society, right? This is really what plays out. Who goes to McDonald's? Who goes to Walmart? Who does this on a regular basis? Et cetera, right? Who participates in this without an awareness of what they're participating in, in a certain way. So this is also a very important aspect here. And to see also recognition, the spiritual at work too, status, right? This is another drive in the society that we have today. So this is, I mean, listen, I'm not one that's into the eternal truths, but the value here is that a lot of the fundamental thought is still very relevant to today, including the rational. Okay, Richard, and then I'm going to go to Edwin. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, regarding the aesthetic,
Yeah,
I mean, I think there's an anxiety of influence about poetry and philosophy, running throughout this, and
right.
even that it starts off with the shield, and one of the things about tragedy basically have 8th century Homeric characters who are kind of out of step with who go beyond a certain limit, and it's the way that battle was fought in Homer. When you read Homer's, it's Ajax or kind of goes out there and does his thing all by himself. Whereas in the 5th century, to survive, the Athenian way of fighting was all about the shields. You would have a phalanx. You would kind of go very tightly organized. Your shield would protect the person on your left. And then you would hold your spear in the right. And they would have layers upon layers of these fighters. And so when one person went down, you'd step up into that place. So the city, there's this tension in 5th century Athens between having to stick together or you just don't last. There's a real sense that being not enslaved is not at all a permanent state of affairs. So there's a real sense that the freedoms they have are contingent, and they depend on kind of holding it together. But on the other hand, they have this tremendous sense of the strength, power, and admiration for these Homeric figures, for these 8th century figures who kind of go out and just do their own thing. And so even in the beginning of this dialogue, where you have the group coming up to Socrates and saying, we're more than you are, that in a way, there's something, to say, I know only that I know nothing about what's justice is very threatening. The city-state, because it really is a heroic stance that Socrates is taking. And in a way, there's this, you can see, the same tensions that you see in tragedy, this poetry and this tension we're going to see in the Republic, because this is a dialogue. I mean, that's drama, that's aesthetics, that's what poetry is to them. Largely is dramatic poetry.
Yeah. The great irony here is that Plato really is a poet.
Yeah.
He's a poet of the dramatic dialogical form. He writes poetry, even though the 10th book and the 3rd book are arguing against what you propose as the aesthetic, right, in a way. Unfortunately, we in the postmodern, and Edwin, and I'll go to you for the question in a second. Unfortunately, in the, quote, postmodern era, if you will, we've had this slippage into the aesthetic. We've had this since, Adorno's aesthetic theory, Lyotard's the postmodern condition. All of these things have put us in that kind of mode that this is where we think and we theorize about perfection. So we leave out these notions of the art of politics or the art of stagecraft at this point, and we have forgotten that completely, even though we have nothing but buffoons. I'm reminded of Henry Miller's great saying that there will come a time when all the politicians sound like dodo birds. Well, it's arrived. I mean, it's been here for a while. It's been here since Reagan, but now we're really seeing dodo, going forward, this level of, discourse. And the election is pitched to a 12-year-old. I mean, this is really the level of the issues to a 12-year-old audience. Anyway, I'm going to go to Edwin, and we'll come back around. These are very, very good points and that are in the thing. Edwin, yeah.
Make sure I'm
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I wanted to bring up this idea. Everyone's been talking about more or less and ruminating about this principled idea of specialization, and sort of how what I'm taking from this is that specialization ensures that the classes will sort of much remain fixed on the relations of power.
Right.
And so the farmers will not want to become warriors, and the warriors will not want to become farmers. Could you sort of, I guess, sort of talk about how this is again going back to this idea of building a city on a principle of reason, and sort of it just seems that everyone will be doing their own thing, and there really won't be, an attack towards the state or anything. Not to say that there won't be uprising from time to time, but for the most part, if the warriors are focused on training and the farmers are focused on farmers, it's going to be business as usual.
Well, let me just mention this. I mean, again, as I mentioned last week, there's a tripart. If you think of Plato, it's good to think in three parts, triparts, as you go forward, right? There are three aspects of the soul. There are three classes, right, that are going on. The three classes being at the bottom, the artisans and the craftspeople, and then you have the guardians and the auxiliaries who protect from that upsurge from below. In some ways, they become kind of like a police force, but they're educated by the philosophers, and we're going to see this at work by the philosopher kings, who are not rewarded materially so much, but don't have to work because they're basically there to think through the good. And the philosopher is the king because the philosopher is the only one that can issue forms, the brain work, the levels of abstraction necessary. So this becomes the class structure. There's very little social mobility, if any, in the Platonic universe. Once a farmer, you remain a farmer. However, Socrates, being the son, again, of a stonemason and a midwife, becomes a famous, interlocutor in the agora, right, in a way. So obviously he had some connection to something, right, going forward. But most of the characters in the Platonic universe, in the dialogues, are from ruling class families. Yeah, they're about this. The sophists are about the ruling class. They go around and give lessons. They're itinerant philosophers like Bruno Gulli, myself, etc., that try to give, anyway, that if we were living then and we didn't have the university to go to, we would go around and give lessons on how to argue, right? Strategies of argumentation. We would be, helping those remain in power through argumentation. So again, these layers are happening at the same time. What is the principle of the argumentation? What kind of argument is being enacted? And as Bruno mentioned, Socrates is the most sophist of the sophists in some ways. He knows all the games, right? And, those of you that know Rimbaud, the poet, the French poet, Arthur Rimbaud, he speaks of Madame Sophistry in some of his poems. The sophist has become this very, very active force in those who can confuse but argue for argument's sake without substance. So this is what, again, and we're going to talk more about this as time goes on and hopefully see it in the text, is that the dialectic, the Platonic dialectic in this case, is an attempt to get to the truth, not to the sophistic level of argumentation. This is why Socrates is always working on that terrain, because the dialectic seeks substance and truth, whatever that is, truth. That's another question. For Alain Badiou, there's no such thing as the truth. There are truth procedures when we get somewhere, right? In a way, yeah. So I don't know if that helps clarify, but there is no really amazing social mobility here. And again, I think that Popper, in terms of his projection, Sir Karl Popper, the British philosopher, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and I like reading the opposition, and I consider Popper part of the opposition. He basically thinks Plato and Marx are on the same page because ultimately they stay within these fixed categories for people, right? In a way, yeah. And that he reads this as a lack of mobility. On both fronts, both in the communist, projection, as well as in the, quote, communist projection of or the Atlantis or utopia that Plato is kind of creating here, this ideal city-state. right? This is an idealist projection. This is an attempt, again, the political economy is a projection that's out there that is trying to build, again, these principles for a political a political community in which the dialogue is unfolding towards those ends. What do you need in a political community? You need a sense of justice. You need to build on justice. You don't build just on libido, right? Yeah, you know what I mean? It's not the side, but in an interesting way, when you look at the Friends for the Society of Crime and Desaad, and Richard knows, and I think it's one of the most interesting things Jacques Lacan ever wrote was Kant of Exade. But if you read the Marquis de Sade, injustice reigns. Injustice is the principle of justice, ultimately.
So that's a standard of morality, more or less, what we're building.
Well, yes and no. Yes. Again, who sets the morality? That is, again, another question. When someone says good or bad, if you read Nietzsche carefully in the Genealogy of Morals, this is a question of identification. This becomes a question of who is the noble class. And in Nietzsche, you can see two turns here at the French Revolution in some ways, vis-a-vis Plato. One is the turn, to the right by a Nietzsche, who says that the French Revolution, I get sick about these notions of equality, and we should return to a radical aristocracy. And he reads, the Platonic, Plato's Republic as the creation of a new aristocracy. And there's much of Plato in Nietzsche, despite Nietzsche's, attacks about Plato, right? And on the other hand, you have, Marx, right, who's going to say, this is a projection of the Egyptian caste system, and we need to struggle for equality. And even though, and Badiou is really looking at this for Badiou, which is interesting to me, and I like this working definition of a democracy. I think it's working very actively for us today. He calls democracy the management of opinions, the management of doxa, right? It's not knowledge, right? So democracy for him is a step, right? The last step before we get to the communist government, right? He's looking at forms of government. We'll see this later in the text. It's all the way at the end. It's on the reading list, there. Yeah. Okay. Please.
Can I just say,
Go ahead, Robert.
I think you're moving a little too quickly to define this as a political book. I think that's a question one has to ask. Is Plato interested in politics? I'm not sure he is. I'm not sure he's trying to create a real state. He starts from the assumption that in order to know, you have to know the definition of something like justice.
Right.
And that definition has to be non-contradictory. It can't contradict itself. And so the first three definitions he discards them. And then he builds this model, which is really a way of saying the only way you're going to get to justice is if you understand what the ultimate reality is, ultimate good is. He doesn't tell us what it is, but he's giving us an educational platform. How does somebody, and he's real clear, there's only going to be a couple of people who are going to be able to do this. How does somebody move beyond definitions into eventually understanding what it is, with all of his myths of how the universe works, which I don't think he takes all that seriously, actually, the way most philosophers do. But I think that's a question. What exactly is the point of this?
Okay, let me see if I understand your question properly here. You're saying that in his investigation into the good, somehow he's not constructing a political state?
No, he is.
Okay.
But I think he's doing it, as he says at the beginning of the section, book 2, starts the construction.
Right.
He's doing it as a way of saying, how do we get to a point where we can understand justice? And at the end, he's saying you can only understand it if you understand the idea, in the Platonic sense of idea, the form of the just good.
Right.
Love, or what, in other dialogues and so forth. And that's I mean, M.I. Finley pointed out long ago, although he
Who did? I'm sorry.
M.I.
Finley.
Finley,
Oh yeah, yeah,
he
yeah.
didn't really want to talk about this. He was very
Right,
snotty about it. He
right.
simply said, the Republic is simply any moron could see as a dialogue on education. I never understood what he
Well,
meant until
yes and
recently.
no.
And
There is a section on education, but there's also a section in that section on education on censorship. What
yeah, but I
stories
mean,
should be told to kids? You know, there are many, many
yeah,
levels to this that go beyond. Yeah,
sure,
yeah, yeah.
sure.
I agree with you. It is an educational model about how the state should educate, etc. And where do we go with this? But it's also a description. That's true of books 3, 4. Certainly 7, the allegory of the cave and the
Yeah.
descent back into the cave. That's all part of the educational model. But at the same time, you also have chapters 8 and 9, which are directly about governmentality. What form of government is the best? So I don't know if Finley's correct in reducing it only to
Well,
an educational.
I'm doing it
Okay, fair enough. Yeah,
as
yeah.
a as a statement, not as a
Okay. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I can hear that, and I
the
hear that.
devil's
Yeah, I hear
argument.
you. It's okay. I like the devil. Yeah. Anyway, the thing to me is again, the educational model is proposed. Yes, as you say, about the good. Yeah, and the movement towards the good in some ways. But again, it's not only about that to my mind. It's also the construction of, why would he call it the Republic or Politeia? Why wouldn't he just call it pedagogia? Or why wouldn't he why wouldn't we have that working throughout?
No,
This is the
absolutely.
point I would ask. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, there are
My,
principles that work in politics. Certainly, Aristotle takes it as a political.
Yes, he called it the
Yeah.
politics. Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. Okay, who else had their hand
my,
up? Bruno, you wanted to say? Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I mean, just one. Actually, the other night we were speaking. Remember about Euthyphro, right? And I wanted to make this remark. I mean, in Euthyphro, an earlier dialogue, no, by Plato, that there is an anticipation of that, especially in relation to the question of definitions, for example, of justice. Well, there maybe the concept used is that of piety, same idea. But there is the formulation of this question, which is, I believe, the fundamental ethical question, which is, remember we were speaking about this last time, it is almost verbatim repeated by Leibniz in a wonderful essay called on the common concept of justice, right? So the question of, that goes back to the question of the strong, what pleases whom. I mean, I can, maybe if you don't mind, I mean, if we have the time, because it's really wonderful, I can read this from Euthyphro, A10, right? You can find that it's the pious, but the just would be the same, the right, no? Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? Which is, a question, we can update it, change gods with humans, people, pious with just. We have the fundamental question of ethics. If you don't mind, again, maybe I'll just read these 2 lines from Leibniz, right, where he says in the essay called Meditation on the Common Concept of Justice, that you can find in this book, The Political, writings of Leibniz, by Leibniz. It is agreed that whatever God wills is good and just. But there remains the question whether it is good and just because God wills it, or whether God wills it because it is good and just. And then, of course, in other places, Leibniz has this very interesting critique of the primacy of the will in theology. He says, no, the primacy is rather of a reason of the understanding. Otherwise, you have a tyrannical regime, right? And so on and so forth, right? So I just wanted to make this remark that applies to what we were talking about. Even if I may, I don't want to be too long, also make just a connection again back to the Unexamined fragment, where, right, actually the word injustice is used rather than justice, right? And necessity as well. I mean, things happen because of necessity at the cosmic level, and then at the ethical, political level too. What is the necessity whereby things are or should be the way they are or should be?
I really hope a lot of this comes clear when we get to books, especially 6 and 7, on the forms, the allegory of the cave, the possibility of going back down into the cave, all of this in terms of the educational philosophy here, right? In many ways. And of course, what is imitation? What does it mean to mime? What does this mean in Plato as well, in terms of the poesis versus that of the philosophical, and how does this play out? Because to me, the beauty of this book, in a certain way, is that the themes of epistemology, certainly education, certainly aesthetics, what does it mean to be act, justly in the world? All of these things are raised in many different ways, right? And these are very, very important things for us today. What about the role of women and children in society? Not that he's right, but at least it's the first to propose this, of which we're still, critiquing and looking at. Should children be let go at 13? Is the Israeli kibbutz in some ways a model that comes out of Plato? Is that another thing that plays out here? Right? Was the taking of children by the state good for the state? What is in the interest of the state? All of these things I think are raised in a way because Plato again to MI6. If you want to look at this in terms of intelligence agencies and what filters down in academic departments. In a way, this has an enormous resonance in terms of totalitarianism as well as open and fertile ground for discussion. So this is the richness, I guess, of the text and philosophy. Again, is Thrasymachus the Marxist in the group? I mean, going back to this today, is Thrasymachus really producing a class argument? We have an argument from the position of meritocracy, or is this is Thrasymachus really giving us the class argument? Is he about the class struggle? This is something that I think we should take seriously, And then why does he become silenced, right? To go on of all this discussion of the good, in a way. What is really happening here in terms of these shifts? Yeah. So yeah. Somebody else want to? Yeah, please, Jerome. Yeah, yeah. You need to unmute. I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah. I know this technology is not natural to a lot of us. Yeah.
This is maybe a side note, but maybe not. You had mentioned Asphalt Jungle at the beginning. There was a movie called The Asphalt Jungle.
Yeah.
And reading this brought it to mind for this reason. Every caper movie is an acting out of something that they talk about here. Goodfellas, The Asphalt Jungle, all of these movies, a group bands together and says, well, society's unjust, so we're going to take what we need. But because they break the laws of justice in society, they are inevitably never able to maintain honor among thieves. So as he says, if a group of tyrants want to take over a country, don't they have to act just amongst each other, right? Don't they have to have harmony amongst each other? If they
honor among thieves.
Yes. And every caper movie is the theme of the answers is always, it's probably an ideological answer, but the answer is always no. There's no honor among thieves. Like in Goodfellas, The Asphalt Jungle, they all end up killing each other inevitably, right?
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, Richard. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that Foucault would emphasize about the ancient Greeks is primarily in regards to sexuality, but eventually in other areas as well, is that, you couldn't kind of historically project back into the Greeks terms and ideas and concepts that grow up in Europe, 1,300 years, 1,800 years later. In other words, you really have to, in a way, try to take them, in some sense, on their own terms. And in another way in which that's true is, in terms of the idea of the city or the city-state and its relation to the human being. Aristotle calls a human being a politikon zoon, a political animal.
Right.
Is that it's, their model is not, the anthropologist Mick Taussig would emphasize this as a Marxist, is that, when Aristotle and Plato write about the relation of the human being, the politikon zoon to the city, it's really that the city is supposed to form the human being. It's the human being's not there to be exploited. In other words, you can't necessarily project back a capitalist model where
absolutely not. Yes, I agree.
the human being is de facto there as in Plato and Aristotle. In some way, the human being is the goal, not a means to an end. We're used to living in a society where a human being is a means to an end, profit.
Right.
But that's not the society as they're conceptualizing it. They're thinking about a society where the human being is the goal.
Yeah. Yeah.
At
Let
the
me,
same time,
yeah, go ahead, Lydia. I'm sorry.
a
Yeah.
historical view of democracy, how far it should be extended, should new immigrants or established immigrants have citizenship and voting rights. These were actual controversies. How far a democracy should be extended was pretty active. And so Thrasymachus could be considered a precursor, if you will, through his role as a radical Democrat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think he positions himself as that. He's a sophist, right? He comes from Gorgias's school. He actually comes out of the school of sophistry, and he actually enters into, yes, this kind of attempt towards, radical democracy. He's really positioning, again, I think, the class argument. He's really saying, what does justice really happen? Again, one of the first philosophers, and we don't really read him in philosophy courses or whatever, is Solon. Solon is the one who reforms the laws. He's the one that brings the cosmological down to earth, proportional allotment, reform of the land, right, etc. And the first communist is Cleothenes, who actually builds another kind of allotment that really distributes the land. So this is a very interesting moment in the 5th century that's very under-theorized in terms of things. Victor Ehrenberg, a very good Marxist thinker, wrote about this, From Solon to Socrates. It's a very, very good book. I recommend it. It's, again, dated work, but something of great substance, right? And Aeschylus in Athens of George Thompson. 2 very, very good books on this notion of how we go from the laws, right, to that of the Socratic moment, to the Platonic and Aristotelian notions of the Politeia, right, and in terms of thinking about justice, what it is. So yeah, but Thrasymachus is an outsider. Yes, please, yeah. Robert?
But it's obvious that Thrasymachus gives up that part of the debate so quickly.
Yeah.
He starts from, this is what a society considers justice, but as soon as Socrates attacks it, he goes to another level of what is justice for the individual.
Well, the discourse switches, as you know,
Right.
what you said, to the good, right? It no longer is a discourse about justice as the advantage of the strong or as of the interest of the strong. It begins to discussion between Glaucon and Adimantus and Socrates about what is the good in itself, the good in its consequences, right? Yeah.
Well, all I'm saying is that Thrasymachus is written as a sophist, that is, someone who is capable of defending almost any position.
Yes.
In fact, that's what he was known for in antiquity. The real Thrasymachus. He taught rhetoric.
Right.
he switches back and forth between many, and many arguments, and he gets himself tangled up in, a Socratic elenchus, which doesn't work the same way that Thrasymachus is used to.
Where do you see him? I'm curious. Where do you see him being tangled by Socrates?
Well,
In the first part here, yeah.
Well, as Cleitophon says, as soon as Socrates says, "Isn't it possible that the rulers don't do the right things for their advantage?" And instead of saying, "Yes, it's possible, and that's one of the realities of life," he says, "No, it's not possible," and he goes to this extremely rhetorical definition that as insofar as they are really rulers, they do everything right, which takes the
right. No, I understand.
direction.
That's a good point. Yeah, and that's the first move by Socrates against Thrasymachus' definition of the justice is the advantage of the strong.
And Cleitophon points that out, actually, but gets crushed.
Yeah.
What if we're actually missing the humor? And what is actually the difference between arguing both sides and irony as a method? I feel like we're missing the possibility that Thrasymachus could be Socrates' equal and could be using irony, and they could be laughing. This could be actually a comedy when they're going back and forth. I feel like this is funny. Of course,
Thrasymachus is the Rodney Dangerfield who comes in and says, "It's hogwash," right? And he jumps on them, and then starts. I understand. Where you're going here. Yeah. It's certainly possible. Yeah. Nathan, yeah.
So I've been thinking about this theme of Socrates being ironic, and I remember Richard and also.
It's not a theme; it's a strategy.
Yes, the strategy.
It's an argumentative strategy. Just right. Yeah.
And I remember Richard and Eloy talked about the role of Socratic ignorance in the formulation of this particular dialogue, and that I just that got me thinking about this term vanishing mediator in the sense that the role of Socrates does not have this sort of positive genitive he does not have this positive or genitive capacity to create some kind of thesis, but rather he's this sort of signifier that has no substance, so to speak. So that as Lydia was pointing out, that in a way Socrates helps his opponents, whose name I just forgot, to figure out to reformulate his previous position. So in a way that got me thinking about this term vanishing mediator, and also perhaps it could be interesting to see why, at least according to Nietzsche, that why Socrates chose his own death. That for Nietzsche, the problem is not that the problem is not that Socrates did it for certain higher good, but rather Socrates was fulfilling his role in the whole tragedy comedy. And
yes,
insofar as in Beyond Good and Evil, I think it was in the beginning, Nietzsche was musing on the role of Socrates being a satyr. So
Nietzsche's take on Socrates is best in the Twilight of the Idols, The Problem of Socrates, in which he says Socrates actually wants to die, that he's suicidal. He makes this claim, that Socrates desires his own death, and that he's the person that got himself taken seriously. What Nietzsche's critiquing there is Socratic dialectics or Platonic dialectics, in a way, that he actually gave the rabble or the voice to the people. This is what Nietzsche is actually critiquing in The Twilight of the Idols about Socrates, right? In a way. I mean, Nietzsche is both close and very far away from Socrates in that way. But he understands Socrates as someone who was that gadfly who had himself, was ugly physically, right? Who actually ultimately became a major player, right? In a way, got himself taken seriously by the use of Platonic dialectics, right? By the use of dialectics. And then ultimately, the logical consequence of the examined life was to die, was to accept one's
Yes,
death,
but also I
accept the
think a
death
lot.
penalty. Is then, of course, the apology, and in the Crito, even more so, since Bruno brought up the Euthyphro, you know, the trilogy really worth reading here about justice, and what is just would be the Euthyphro, the apology, and the Crito. That would be the major part of the trilogy. One would work with the death of Socrates, and you know what it means to live the just life. Yeah, but go ahead. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
Yeah.
Just another point that I had, what I had in mind is that, well, I agree with your take on Nietzsche's reading of the death of Socrates, but also I think Nietzsche, in a way, he was suggesting that, you know, the fact that Socrates chose to die was of a certain necessity, of a certain dramatic,
Yeah.
theatrical necessity, and so much
Fair
so
enough.
that, you know, the Socratic turn ushered in a totally new order. And if we tie this into the project of emancipation, in a sense that we could remind ourselves of the adage, revolution eats her own children. You know, so that you know, after after the evil revolution, the last thing to be removed of the old order is the revolutionary herself. So in a way, this is, you know, in a way, it's both tragic and comic, because
Right.
as a vanishing meteor, as a midwife, the empty signifier has to be rehabilitated. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just what I had in mind.
Richard,
Well, I wanted to agree. You know, one of the things about, you know, one definition of tragedy from etymology is that it's the song of the goat, and the goat is this sacrificed animal. And pharmakon, one of this word that comes up as poison in medicine, you know, also means with a change of accent, it means scapegoat. And in a way, and this is about these heroic characters in Greek tragedies, who, you know, who are admired but are finally eliminated. They're finally, somehow their ideas, their concepts have to be brought into the city, the 5th century city, but the actual individuals who live out so heroically put the city at too much of a risk. And there's a way in which I think, you know, again, we start out with a battle, the many against the one, they come up, Socrates, please come join us. There's a way in which it's foreshadowing, you know, again, and the tension with poetry that keeps coming up, which is, of course, tragedy, that there is a way in which Socrates is in some way in requires his own elimination.
Yeah, he's a necessary victim. He's the necessary scapegoat.
Yes,
We can read it that way in terms of the apology, and he understands that if you read the Crito carefully. It's the reason of state, going back to the philosopher, right? Actually adhering to the rule of law, right, in that case. That's what's really going on in the Crito. It's the philosopher who believes in the reason of state, the authority of the state, versus that of the authority of the philosophical good. Socrates has a confidence. There's nothing there. But although he is basically condemned by a few votes by the Athenian jury, and then when he refuses the death penalty, the actual amount of people that want to convict him goes up. This is a material fact in the archives. 100 more people vote for him to die after they hear it's absurd. I mean, you talk about comedic, Lydia. He says, well, maybe I can pay a 1 mina, like us paying $5 fine, right? Or I can go to the nice old age home and live out my days there in the country club, right? Like, what's the name of this TV actress that was getting her kid into college by bribing people? She wants to choose the country club jail. Whatever her name is. Anyway, all to say, yeah. Okay. So anyway, yeah. So it's important to keep that in mind too. That he's again choosing his death, but at the same time, it's very convenient of the city-state at that moment to give him the death penalty. And he may understand this. Nietzsche's much more subtle and profound in understanding this in terms of the rule of state. And I want to position this in a certain way. I mean, this is worthy of thinking about. I'm not saying it's the best analogy, but it's worth looking at. If you know Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, and then Merleau-Ponty's Humanism and Terror during the Stalinist show trials, you begin to see this play out in communist history. And that you begin to see this going on. Do you follow the line of the party, right? And the show trial of which this is taken from, where Koestler draws his Materialist from Nikolai Bukharin, who's ready to die for the revolution in 1917 and is a major player, alongside Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Zineov, et cetera, et cetera. But, by 1936, he basically submits fully to the will of the party, right? In a certain way. So what I mean, again, what is the notion of the trial here, right? And the rule of law, and what does justice mean? And Sartre has argued in some ways, as has in a more subtle way Isaac Deutscher, but Sartre in particular of the French philosophers, and I'm sure Badiou would be on this page, is that Stalin was a necessary moment, Stalinism, that the show trials were necessary in a certain way for socialism in one country. And this was a notion: be killed or kill. Was a part of that moment from 1929, if you will, to 1953, or particularly from 1935 till 39, right? In terms of the show trials, etc. So this is an interesting. I think you can draw very good parallels to the historical moments here. Yeah, in a way. And going back to Nietzsche, this whole notion, Socrates wants his death. He's not arguing, he's not trying to get out of it.
That's what Xenophon
He's offering
says.
an escape.
Except but Xenophon doesn't have a philosophical purpose. He just says Socrates didn't want to get old and have all,
yes.
That's all.
Well, he was 70.
Yeah.
He was already old.
He didn't want to get
right? I mean, in some
infirm,
ways,
older and infirm.
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is,
right.
As I'm nearly 80 now, and I can tell you
you're very sharp. Good.
It's a possibility.
Right. No, I understand. And I'm glad you bring up Xenophon. He's another source. There are three major sources for the character of Socrates. Of course, Plato, which is the most favorable one. Aristophanes and the clouds and the birds, the comedic Socrates, which he actually refers to in the Apologia. And then, of course, Xenophon, Memorabilia of Socrates. So these are the three major sources of what we have on Socrates, going back. And the historical Socrates, as I mentioned to you, and I think it's good to look at the early Socrates, because if you remember the trial, and I'm sorry, I mean, maybe some of you haven't read all of these things, but the Apology should be read by everybody. It's, one of the great documents of Western literature. You begin to see Socrates divides himself into the early and the late Socrates. the two accusations, one of the negative characterization of Socrates that Aristophanes gives in the Clouds. And the trial begins with an attempt, going back to what Lydia said, the caricature of himself. He actually confronts this comedic, view of him in the beginning, right? And he has to answer those charges. And then he answers the formal charges of what he did to corrupt the youth, how he introduced a new deity into the state. To me, I read that between the lines. He's introducing the possibility of revolution or overturning the state. I don't think he's introducing Apollo to Zeus, right? On the Mount Olympus, right? What is this whole thing of claiming Apollo as the deity or as the patron, during that period? And then, of course, the other charge, atheism, which he demolishes, but that was a death penalty if you were an atheist in ancient Greece. That was on the books as a crime that elicited the death penalty. So this again, you have this historical character that is, interesting, that's been taken up by many different people, including Nietzsche. Again, Nietzsche is so clever and so smart, whether you agree with him or not, he's one of the best writers that the tradition ever had. And he's very, very sharp in terms of his, the alacrity and the depth of the thought. This is like reading, Paul Virilio's on speed and politics, and Nietzsche has this ability to cut to the chase so quickly, right? And to really see what's going down. The psychological acting's unbelievable. Yeah. As Freud says, he was a nobility to which I could not attain to in my youth. I never read him. Of course, Freud read him, but then Freud was good at, saying what he didn't read. Or he got it from the muse's mouth through Andreas Salome, his friend that was part of the early Freudian cycle. And anyway, so to go back to this, I wanted to know what you thought of Badiou's rewriting of this, the early part, how he treated Thrasymachus, etc. I want to also point out, and I'm going to do this now that he's not here today, but Yazid did a great job on the website that Matt put out earlier in terms of the readings. I'll do a commentary of where we are, right? And maybe on some of these subject matters to kind of keep us grounded, since we have a lot going on here. But this question of justice is very, very important for our time. How are we going to build a political possibility, number one, and a political community? Look, I would suspect that everybody here is a leftist or has leftist proclivities. How do you basically give something, to the public of where the good, what are you offering, right, in terms of the good of the future? How do you propose this? What can we learn from this in terms of both, everything from education to the aesthetic model to, what is our notion of justice? How do we get there, right, in some ways? Because I don't find cancel culture to be justice, personally. I think it plays right into the hands. The right wing couldn't have created a better moment for themselves.
Right.
People don't understand this. They go right in the moment. It's kind of mass psychology. I don't know if any of you know the French author Denis Derougemont, Love in the Western World, but he talks about mass psychology going to rallies and how you get swept up in the mob, right, etc. And we can talk about that, the tyranny of mob rule, which again Badiou and Plato kind of work with, right, as well. So we can speak to that. So yes, Nathan, go ahead.
Could I just quickly ask
Sure.
if this cancel culture is just another example of what Nietzsche called slave morality, or
ironically, they want to take down anything that had to do with slavery. However, but yes, of
he
course.
talks about the middle class, who just go to church, but then, they don't really believe anything, and they just go back to their bourgeois life and so on and so forth. And the whole, bourgeois non-culture is illustrated by this, what he calls the spirit of envy, or spirit of
Ressentiment. Ressentiment, which is really the beginning
right.
of Christianity. Nietzsche sees the beginning of ressentiment that plays out from Platonism for the people, to use a Gramscian term, and the ressentiment plays out from Christianity all the way up until the French Revolution. The French Revolution to Nietzsche, I know this is not a course on Nietzsche, but I'm very close to Nietzsche personally, you know, in my own readings and thinking over the years. But anyway, Nietzsche thinks that the French Revolution is again the tragedy of Christianity replayed once again as farce.
Where does Nietzsche, slave morality, where in Nietzsche?
It's in the Genealogy of Morals.
Genealogy of Morals, right.
Towards the Genealogy of Morals, which on one level is a response to Paul Ray, who's an English psychologist who wrote a book called The Origin of Moral Sensations. You know, this was the English psychologist. And of course, the Germans, vis-a-vis the English, also Paul Ray happened to be the husband of Lou Andreas Salome, who Nietzsche had a thing for. So Nietzsche argues with, he knew Paul Ray and liked him, but at the same time, there's an underlying, motivation going on here too. But yes, it is an attempt against English psychology, you know, or as Freud used to say, the Englishman Ernst Jones, you know, his biographer, you know, the English were never, I mean, certainly Winnicott and Melanie Klein and Fairbairn and others have made great contributions to psychoanalysis, but Freud, in a way, was never really taken by the English school so much, even though they got him into London, yeah, right, and paved the way, and there was, a great attempt on his behalf. So anyway, yeah, so the Genealogy of Morals. This is, again, a very interesting work in which slave and master morality, noble and base, and how this language appears and how value systems, and really to go back to what Robert was saying, the textual reference of justice, right, is actually positioned in all of this. It's very important, I think, too, to see this. You know, how language, the philodoxa, if you will, friend to the opinion, or the philological, is actually working out very carefully. Foucault's right. Nietzsche is one of the great philologists of all times. Yeah, right. Materially.
Definitely.
This is really the important. He's really an exceptional philologist in this sense. Really understands force and stress in language. And for those of you who want a great essay on Nietzsche, the genealogy essay, History by Nietzsche, is one of the great essays. It's in Foucault Reader. You know, genealogy, history. I forgot the third, the triad. It's not carnival, but something along that line. Very important essay about stress in language, the stress in language. Yeah, please.
This is an article by Foucault on Nietzsche. Is that right?
Genealogy, history. Let me see. I may have it right here. I'm not sure. No, it's not here. It's in. Basically, it first appeared when John Rochman did Nietzsche's Return at Columbia back in the late 70s, early 80s in the semiotext. Yeah, genealogy, history, you know, but it's really about stress. It's about Ursprung, the stress in the text, that originative moment, right? In a sense. Yeah. So a very, very important essay, you know, in the philology. Now, what Badiou tries to do is become, you know, philodoxical. He says he's doing a philodoxical. I don't know how much you read of the Badiou, but the Badiou is really an attempt to, again, work with the Greek language in such a way to make it more contemporary, right? And to put this in contemporary things, right? Yeah. So, yeah, there it is, genealogy, history. Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. Yeah. You guys are great. The next generation is fantastic at this location of PDFs. I'm very impressed. Right? I'm a stack person. I get lost in the stacks in the library. You know, I'm still stacking. You know, so to speak, right? You know, what's in the stack, what's in the chat, right? Right. So anyway, I mean, to go back to this to the Badiou, I mean, I'm interested in what you think about the approach, the way he rewrites. I mean, part of the task here, and I mean, this is certainly my intention, is to be able to see how you rewrite a text in ancient philosophy to make it modern. Right, in a way, it's like, you know, I'm not crazy about Nikos Konstantakis' rewriting of the Odyssey for our times, but he did this, the modern Odyssey, right? Rewrote the Odyssey. Joyce, of course, as you know, rewrote, Ulysses, right? In a sense, into today. Badiou is attempting this when 16 chapters to do Plato's Politeia, yeah, in many ways. So yeah, so I'm interested in what you have to say about this, and then I'll let you go because I know people don't want to go much later than 9:15, 9:20. So any thoughts about what he does? Yeah, yeah. I mean, what he's doing here?
Well, at least in this early section, I didn't see that it improved Plato at all or made it more accessible.
Right.
I think it did the opposite. It was too breezy.
Too breezy, you said?
Yeah, just too colloquial.
Okay, interesting.
And the easy change of Adamantus into Amantha didn't do much for, you know,
Okay,
to bring women into something that Plato doesn't deal with.
right. Well, he's trying again to bring the woman character
Yeah,
into the modern.
it's a great idea, but
Yeah,
I mean, it doesn't seem to add anything much
Okay.
at this
Well,
point.
let's see how she plays out. She has some very interesting moments with Socrates. I'm kind of interested to hear from from all of you about that. How Amantha really plays out. She's a very interesting character in a way. Yeah.
She has more humor than anybody else. Going
She
back
does
to
have
what
humor.
Lydia said,
Yeah, it's true.
something we shouldn't forget.
Yeah, Jerome. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I have kind of a question about that. It's kind of fun to read and it's amusing, but I wonder if, somebody who probably knows more about Badiou than me, where he inserts the formalizing of the argument, with, what do you think his intention is behind that? It's, kind of fun to read, but.
What do you mean the formalizing of the
Where
argument?
he breaks it into a formula for
I
W1.
see.
Yeah. Where
He's very much into formulas. Badiou's basis here is very interesting, and we'll go over this when we get to chapter 6 and also Badiou. Badiou really thinks that Plato's great contribution to objective reality is is that of mathematical ontology. He actually argues with Heidegger that there's a poetic ontology at work here, right? Or some people would say just an epistemology, the knowledge of the forms. So Badiou is always trying to make formulas out of things, right? To build this into equations, right? So this formalization is based on his mathematical training. I think, as I mentioned last week, his first day, if you will, lecturing in France was at Althusser's behest, where he did a section on the concepts of number, right? And he came out of this very, history of mathematics, philosophy of mathematics tradition. And his ontologies, his three major works, go into a very elaborate, modern mathematical, mathematicians, Riemann, Frege, right? Zirkel, all of the things, set theory, etc. Yeah.
Ironically, the Straussians, too. I remember working with Seth Benedetti, and we'd wind up with these all these mathematical formulas about why there were so many, that there was hidden in the text this whole kind of mathematical argument.
Right.
So it's fascinating to me that two approaches that ideologically are so in conflict, yet have this common interest in this kind of mathematical uncovering these mathematical formulations.
Well, I think it raises again where we started tonight. I mean, to kind of try to come somewhat full circle, that the mathematical in proportion is also operative here. Is justice, in a way, can it be formalized mathematically? I'm not saying just to make it into a formula, but this notion of symmetry and proportion are certainly mathematical principles, right? That you could apply to justice. How do you weigh things? What are the metrics that one uses, etc.? What are the measures, right? In a sense. And then we're going to see this idiocy play out in this new Supreme Court, thing. But if I'm Mitch McConnell, if you're smart on the Republican side, you say, well, there was something called the Warren Court, right? You're saying we're stacking it, but look what happened post-Roosevelt, etc. So this is not new in American politics. That's another thing. Everybody's going to join the mob and not understand this in terms of a longer, series of precedents that this old, quote, Southern, Republican guard, basically authoritarians. No, they know this stuff, in a way. So, this is again problematic to the left to be able to argue this. Why, why are we going to get these, basically Clarence Thomas part two, but this time in the guise of a Cuban woman or evangelical or something like that. This is not exactly Mark Kagan, who's a professor at CUNY's sister, Elaine Kagan, or Sotomayor, right? We're not on that level of legal ability and agility. So this is, again, another problem we're facing. But going back to, yes, the formulas, yes, he loves this kind of thing. And, philosophers especially trained, as Richard was saying, Straussian, and in some ways, those that come out of the French tradition, especially out of the French mathematical, love this too. They love to put this in. It's based on the analogon, that analogy somehow can be formalized. The law, this is again, this is all part of the secrets of philosophy, the law of the analogon, the analogy, the law of analogy. The craft, the techne, is part of the law of analogy. Yes, Andrew, and then I'll go back to Richard. Yeah.
In terms of set theory, I'll just preface this by saying I really know nothing about math. It's like the worst.
Yeah.
But where Badiou is going is it's a kind of cosmology that's kind of non-representational. I mean, it's basically the traction there.
Absolutely.
Is that there's no, it's not about anything, that the number only represents itself. And
well, the lemma. It's about the lemma. The lambda, epsilon, mi, alpha. It's about the lemma. Yeah.
So, and I can just add that something that had a big impact on me was the concept of every set, assuming there are similar components or components that by which one could render a set based upon certain similarities within its constituent elements contains the zero with the diagonal through it, which is the null set, or that which is not zero and that which does not belong to this set, or I should say it's included in the set, but it doesn't belong to the set in the sense it doesn't share the elements of the other set.
Right.
So that seems to just open up a tremendous space in terms of analyzing situations, the constituent elements of situations, and the possibility of transforming that situation.
Well, you speak like Badiou because he uses the language of situation very much like you do in a lot of the mathematical formulation. This goes on in a book called Being an Event, which is his ontology. So he does speak to that, this element that you're talking about in a situation. He also has a theory of less than zero subtraction, that we really are learning from subtraction, not from additives, etc. This is really his process, is this process of the minus moving away, right, in some ways.
Who's this?
Talking Badiou.
But also I want to say
please.
a political implication of this idea that every set includes the null set, or whatever it is, the zero with the line through it. It's not zero, right? It's not nothing, but it's something that's included in the set, which is other than all of the other elements that have a link to each other by which they can be called a set. To me, the implication there, or one of the implications, is the possibility of absolute transformation of the set.
Yes.
If the set represents a situation, then this is the possibility of, I don't know at what scale, but this is, I read this as the possibility of event. You know, I read this as the possibility of revolution. And I want to slow down there because
It's okay. I mean, you're on to something here vis-a-vis Badiou. I mean, I know Badiou fairly well, and the thought, so to speak, that in a way, what you're reproducing here and telling us in a very good way is his investigation into the Chinese Revolution, what he sees as the problems that happened during the Cultural Revolution and how the reactionary forces played out. And he does this through sets, just as you were speaking to it. This is why there's a lot of that. This is a guy, I mean, my admiration is that this is someone who never would sell out his thought. He never went the way of the compromised reformist movements, right? He held to his fidelity. Whether he's right, wrong is another story, but this is someone that has been faithful to his principles of what he thinks the event is, right? In a way, and did not compromise. And as someone mentioned, he has his political organization, etc. So this is someone like Socrates, not afraid to die, and is very uncompromising in his way.
And
among the French intellectuals, right? Many ways.
I
right?
just want to add that my sense of, I've read portions of Being an Event. I haven't read the other two books, Logic of the World and the last one.
Yeah, The Immanence of Truths. Yeah.
But also the second Manifesto for Philosophy. I was really shocked at the difference in tone and of scale of those books, in the sense of really putting together a very, I want to say, a kind of, in terms of referencing the infinite set, right? A really kind of vast possibility, poetic possibility for, I don't want to say a totalizing concept, but a possibility that's really at a kind of ultimate scale of dealing with problems relative to the human and the planetary. And vis-a-vis his tone in this reconstruction of the Republic, which is so kind of just colloquial, as was mentioned already here, and not particularly graceful, I want to say, maybe in the English translation, I don't know, but very almost a kind of, I actually found it kind of confusing, the kind of just the drama of it at a scale that's much more, I want to say, almost primitive, in terms of.
Well, maybe. I mean, I just want to point out again, to situate Badiou, he gave courses on Plato 2009, 2010, 2011, heavily attended in France. This was before his retirement. There were 500-600 people in the audience, right? This was post-financial crisis, right? In a different way. His claim, again, is that, and I mentioned the 6 things that are in Reinhardt's introduction, which are really Badiou speaking, the anti-Platonism that exists in our modern philosophy. So this is his intervention in a way. This is, again, a translation from the French. He actually speaks about this, the problems of translation, that the French language is analytical, The English language is descriptive,
Descriptive.
right, in a way. He has a very interesting attempt here. And I would add the German is basically conceptual, and it really is a question of compounds. You're always thinking in broad concepts, right, with the German, that kind of gestalt, that shaping.
Yeah.
So in a way, this is always a problem in translation.
Yeah, so I just want to say, I don't consider myself in any position to critique.
No, I understand. I'm just trying to address where you're saying here. And I think the colloquialism is to make it accessible for today's reader in some ways. I think it gets more complicated. Listen, he has a very good section here, and I think it's worthy of discussion. I mean, we're just starting, right? What is an idea? What is a philosopher, right? He's asking serious questions, and he will expand upon that in a way that that opens up, I think, a lot of trajectories of thought, to my mind, right, in some ways. And then he's going to go on about the relationship, and this is something we really have to talk about, because if the left has any possibility of existing going forward, it has to have a theory of, justice and what a political community will deliver in terms of real happiness. What is happiness in relationship to justice? And this is a question that both Plato and Badiou raise, as does Stiegler. Stiegler has the categories of symbolic misery and animesis, right?
You were very clear in the last set, in the Stiegler set. Look, event just happens. You cannot choreograph this.
Right, exactly.
And I want to say, well, we're going to have to be in a position to get with the wave and know how to be in a position, but I don't know if this can be formed.
The problem is the waves don't really have that kind of direction we want. I mean, we need some direction to the waves. I don't want to live in a world of cancel culture.
No.
To me, I really don't. I mean, unfortunately, no matter how much, et cetera, I think this is anti-thought. In some ways, it's part of authoritarian personalities. It's a nascent authoritarian desire, right? It speaks to an underlying homogeneity that Bataille puts out in an excellent psychological study of fascism, which I think is a very profound, I think it's an advance on Wilhelm Reich's mass psychology of fascism. At the same time, we have to come to terms with the past. And we have to think about this. What is justice of reparations? What does that mean? Ultimately, and in a sense, these are significant ethical obligations to any intelligent person or any person that is, as you say, transforms oneself and the world, right? To work on the 11th thesis of Marx, right? And does reading transform? And what does that lead in terms of act? Right? It's not so simple. Again, like I said earlier, it's not so simple that the idea hits the street and vice versa.
Right.
This correspondence thing that we all look for and the way activists talk, to me, is very limited, right? It actually is almost a position of defeat before we really get started. I think, personally. Yeah, I think. Yeah. I mean, look at the DNC. You talk about a death wish. I mean, I hate to say it, but you talk about a death wish. Look at what's going on here. Yeah? I mean, you've got an alpha male basically ready to devour, right, a passive, quote, man who proposes decency, right? In a sense.
Right.
Decency versus, right, mafia capitalism. Now, you think most people in the world, as long as you deliver the goods, they don't care if it's delivered by mafia capitalism. This is a question that we have. Yeah. As long as the goods are delivered, right? What does this mean to us? I mean, these are serious questions. It's not about but Trump is an entertainer. He's a P.T. Barnum. You talk about the satirical and the farcical at work. You see it in him. He can turn on it. You talk about a master of colloquialisms and a master of the instant. He's really good at this. I mean, it's fascist, it's right-wing populist, all of these things. It's very clear. It's been examined by, everybody from Ed Herman, Noam Chomsky, back to Theodore Adorno, to Bernays, etc. All of these techniques have been studied, but at the same time, he gets away with it. Sleepy Joe. Why hasn't he done anything? He's been in office 47 years. What did he do? Now, you speak to a crowd that's uneducated, in a certain way, they're going to pick up on this immediately and say, he's right. Why would I vote for this guy? I might not vote for Donald, but why would I go vote for Biden? Yeah, a professional politician. 47 years. Yeah. And the next thing that's going to come out of Trump's mouth, we're going to go drain the swamp. Yeah. Joe's the sleepy creature of the Black Lagoon, coming out of the thing. I mean, I should be writing script for these people, but they're pretty good at it. No, I'm just, but think about this in a certain way. What we're facing here, because of this dumbing down, this is a very long program in terms of the United States. I think I mentioned to you Marcuse. I don't know if he used these exact words, but he said education in the United States is the systematic moralization of the public. Yeah. It's systematic, what goes on, in the schools. This dumbing down, this use of, the curriculum. The number one problem of going back to school is the curriculum.
Well, I just want to say
that going back to get COVID, it's the curriculum. Most teachers go back to teach.
The right, I want to say the right now is acting from the position that they're the only ones who will use guns.
Well, that's another question too. And I mean, I don't know if Lydia, I know Richard probably has written, but in a way, Conrad Lorenz's book on aggression, the left is afraid of aggression. The left is afraid of power. This has been the case for many years. Afraid of taking power. This is really what it is. Rick Wolf told me when he was elected in New Haven to city council, or he came close to winning, he was frightened to death that he actually would have to go to the city council. Right? And he's gotten over that now, but this is where he was, right? In this respect. My buddy Aronowitz is not afraid. He'll go duke it out in the unions, right? Even though, he's 87 now and confined. But all to say, I mean, think about this too. The right is not afraid of power, not afraid of taking power, not afraid of abusing power, and not afraid of violence, right? And on the other hand, the left is about, what do we talk about? Civility, right? Politesse. We agree to disagree. This is the level. This is the liberal consciousness, right? And even that encroaches upon the left. So until we come to terms with this, I mean, in a way, until we become like the wild beast or the zon politikon, as Richard, pointed out that Aristotle calls the human being as a political animal, we're not going to be on point. We'll be talking about all the great books we read and the beautiful sculpture we saw in the Metropolitan Museum, or it's great that MoMA's back open, or whatever. Something's at the Getty in L.A. or whatever. I really, and this becomes the reduction again to aesthetics too, that you have somehow become this kind of elite that steps back, in this aesthetic world, because why get your hands dirty in the mess with power? And this is something that why I brought up earlier. Lenin, Trotsky, etc. The original, the Bolsheviks, right? The Chinese communists, certainly Fidel and the merry band of revolutionaries in the Sierra Madre being defeated 55, 57, finally taking power in 59. All of these, these groups were not afraid of power or violence. And I'm not saying that you have to have an armed revolution. I'm not saying that. But really, in a way, why this fear of really taking power? Why so much, and I see this in the academic institutions. This has become a problem too. That professionalization is part of a new cop consciousness. The real police is professionalization. Everybody is institutionally bound by rules. We can't take a risk because Title IX says this. or we can't take a risk because of the legal consequences of something. Very little action, because of the restrictions that have been put up by the institutions. So anyway, most people that have a bone of radicality in them think of themselves in the institutions, but not of it. And that's a very difficult line to walk all the time. I know Josefa at Loyola University with our friend John Clark went through this in a way that the colleagues aren't really with you, right? In a way, you become the lone person in a department, or you become, the scapegoat in some ways, right? In many senses. So this is going on. And this is all part of professionalization. We're facing a generation since the 1990s that is educated for career, for job readiness and career, and that most academics publish to pad resumes. They don't publish to educate or to learn or to become a part of a community of learned people. I'm not saying everybody, but the majority do it in terms of symbolic academic capital, right? In a way. Yeah. This is really what's going on.
Yeah,
And the problem is, you publish instead of teaching. Bruno does both, which is good. Yeah, he does both,
I
right?
just want to say
He
on a
doesn't
personal,
sacrifice his teaching for his writing. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
just on a personal
Yeah,
level, I
yeah,
mean, I never, I couldn't exist within the university, that's for the reasons that you're speaking to. I'm not saying that, that's been a kind of, to say the least, kind of a blessing and a curse, and but I think you're speaking to the reasons why.
I mean, the universities are not really authorizing anybody at this point. This is part of the problem. There's no real thinking that is allowed, in a way. I mean, people can think and they can work at home and work in their study, etc., but the stakes aren't collective. The stakes are only individual, and you try to retain your sanity on that line. But it's not a place where you're going forward, in the sense of, building a real momentum or movement.
Yeah, and the question of authorization.
Turning point, Michael, about
Yeah,
this.
go ahead, Lydia. Yeah, I'm sorry.
You have a sense of the historical turning points about how this decline has been taking place?
Yeah, I think this really begins with the Reagan years in many ways. I mean, it went through certain ups and downs, but now it's pretty embedded. You had in the Reagan years the defunding, of education, of public schooling. CUNY, for example, used to be free in New York City. CUNY has 275,000 students, right? And and real good education. You could go hear Albert Einstein at City College, or Thomas Mann back in the day, or Moses Finley. I know someone that we mentioned Finley earlier has left, but you could hear Finley early on, in the 50s at Brooklyn College, etc. And this was all for free, right? And the New York Public Library was open 24 hours, right, etc. Right? So you had this kind of closing, if you will. Alan Bloom wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind. It's a good title. It happened. He had all the wrong reasons about it. That somehow readings of new things were happening. We shouldn't be reading Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, Richard Wright so much, or whatever. Okay. Good night, Josefa. Thank you. Yeah, good. Bye. Yeah, I mean, I see the turn with the Reagan years intensified. It kind of opened up. There was an opposition to the Reagan years. There was still good scholarship going on and confrontation. But I think Clinton kind of leveled, it all out. And then it was one thing after another. No Child Left Behind, which is, a program that comes from the Bible. This is part of the rapture, right? No Child Left Behind. This is a religious code that Bush took up. Everybody thought it was like every child should be in school. No, every child should be reading the Bible and doing the pledges of allegiance. And this became part of the thing. One reason the right is so strong is they took over the schools. They took over local governments. The left was asleep. All these years. This started in the 70s. you know, in a way, where they got on school boards, they began to work out curriculums, etc. You can go to schools in Afro-American neighborhoods, and these kids aren't getting James Baldwin, Richard Wright, much less Malcolm X. None of this is being taught. It's all bullshit. Job readiness. You got to learn technical skills. You got to learn programs and stuff like that. There's no consciousness anymore about this. Whereas, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, you know, you could talk to a prisoner and they had read, you know, everything. They really were on top of things, right? You had law degrees being getting in prison, you know, etc. So anyway, I see this real massive
just at
decline.
a small scale.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, the opposition is declining all the time, even though there's much more of a movement and there are many more states, and I think young people are recognizing. One thing I'm noticing in my classes with the students I teach, and in some cases are 19 to maybe 22, they're very interested. Yeah, they have an interest. They're more serious than they were 8 to 10 years ago. You know, they seem to be pressured. They don't know much. They don't have much of a background to take forward, but they're interested and they're out there in a sense. So this is maybe a very small, hopeful sign. If you know, then the question is, who are the professors who can deliver to them? That's part of the problem. You know, you may have, like Breck used to say, you have a lot of listeners, but nobody to talk to them, right? He used to say this about radio theory. There are a lot of people that want to listen, but there's nobody really to speak to them. He said this during the 30s in Germany. So anyway, yeah, again, this is a question for us. I mean, one of the reasons for this kind of alternative, you know, learning projects is to try to, you know, get something going where the left finally can have its own schools or can have its own moment. You know, the Communist Party, if you went to Jefferson School in the 1950s in New York City, I mean, I wasn't there. I know about this through, you know, discussion, but you got a good background. Philosophy, literature. You had Sigmund Finkelstein on culture. You had, what was his name? Wells, Harry Wells on pragmatism in the U.S. These were people that knew stuff. You were reading Aristotle at 16 years old, you know, in a way. We don't have anything even close to that anymore. You know, this again, to me, is a material problem, you know, in many ways. So, yeah. And I agree with Marcuse and Stiegler. Stiegler calls it, you know, the generalized stupidity, you know, generalized proletarianism and stupidity, what's going on. And, you know, Marcuse in a way that it's been systematic. I mean, they don't sit around and say to each other, we're going to make all our people dumb. They're dumb and they make policy, right? This is the thing. I mean, I don't believe this conspiracy that they're that smart to say, you know, we're going to do this and keep the people dumb this way. They censor, of course. You know, I mean, can you imagine we're 2020 and we're hearing about New York City being an anarchist jurisdiction from the Attorney General? Can you imagine this? No, New York City is a conservative place at this point. It has no radicality anymore. A few radicals, but very, very, very few, you know, in a way. Yeah. Yeah, Nathan. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm ranting here, but anyway.
Okay. Speaking of education, could I just ask like a very specific question? This
Yeah,
probably has
sure.
very little to do with Badiou, but as there is something to do with my class. There's a class I'm taking in school.
Hey, Sudi?
It's on Plato's Parmenides, which for me is like very interesting, very difficult text.
Who's teaching the Parmenides?
Alan Kim.
Yeah, I don't know him. Okay.
Yeah, he's a little bit older than me, I think, and he's a neo-Kantian.
Okay.
Yeah, that already kills.
A neo-Kantian teaching Parmenides?
Yeah, he's a neo-Kantian.
I feel for you. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
My desire is totally gone after like 3 meetings because I mean the secondary sources he introduces just does such a good job to dissuade me from actually studying the text.
Well, you
So,
should talk to your advisor or your friend, Robert Harvey. I think that's right, right? Do I remember that correctly?
yeah, Harvey.
Harvey, your advisor. He's a good guy, and you should tell him bring his friend Etienne Balibar.
Well, I just,
Yeah.
I'm just asking for advice for like some sort of a secondary literature
On Parmenides, the great reading, Bruno's good on Parmenides, but to me, one of the great readings of Parmenides is Heidegger.
Yeah,
It's a very beautiful step-by-step analysis of the poem, right? And it's an actual course on Parmenides, and it's also repeated in some ways when he tries to reconcile being and becoming in the introduction to metaphysics.
But I was, yeah.
That's it. See, Bruno has it on the shelf ready for you.
It's
Yeah.
actually.
See, we know how to sell the product, right?
It's actually Plato's Dialogue. That's the one we're reading.
Oh, you're reading Plato's Dialogue. Well, he's also going to comment on that too.
Okay.
Yeah. Another person you want to look at is Alexander Mouralatos. He's a Greek philologist who's at Princeton. Very good book on the path of Parmenides, and he mentions Plato's Parmenides, which is the founding text for those of you interested in logical contradiction. It's the founding treatise on logical contradiction in Western philosophy. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Beryl. Yeah, we see it. Thank you. Yeah. See you next week, I hope. Yeah. So, so I don't know. And, you can email me and I can, do more. I don't want to,
Sure,
just.
no, it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, I feel for you that neo-Kantianism is a real regression on the history of philosophy. Yeah, in a way. Yeah. I'm an anti-philosopher because most philosophy is bullshit and, in a way. I take this up from Merleau-Ponty, in a different way, Deleuze, certainly Badiou. These are all important subject matters. And, also, the Marxists have very good studies too on Parmenides, but unfortunately, the Marxist tradition, and I really hope you're part of this generation that's coming up, the materialist history of life has not been written yet. There have been attempts by Lange and others, but really what's lacking in the history of philosophy and philosophical approaches is the materialistic history of philosophy, right? Very, very strange that it has not been done. There have been small attempts, but not really successful. But this is a project that should be ongoing. Yeah. How do you read philosophy through a materialist lens? The interesting thing about Badiou to me, one of the reasons I want to read this personally, alongside this Plato, is that he has this category called democratic materialism, right? Right. Yeah. Yes. You're right, John. Amy Goodman is the liberal gatekeeper for the Democratic Party. Right. Anyway, with all due respect, Amy, she's struggled many years, but it's become the democracy now is DNC now. Yeah, Democratic National Committee now. That's unfortunately where we are. Part of the problem where we are too is we've gotten so indoctrinated and fixated on the anti-Trumpism, right? Which is necessary, of course. Nobody's supporting this fool. But the problem is we have no issues out there right now. It's all about anybody but Trump, right? It's a very reductionistic approach to politics in the worst sense. Yeah. And nothing about the issues. Biden cannot take up the public health discourse. It's all about management of COVID. Okay, what else is new? Watch when they come up with a vaccine or they start talking about Moderna and Pfizer and AstraZeneca and all these companies, Johnson and Johnson, that may have vaccines and they may be ready by February and they get the CDC to verify this. Watch what happens in the election, right? Part of the October surprises, which were around the corner. Yeah, in terms of this. Yeah. So this is, again, another problem that we have. We've become so systematic, moronized, and so generalized stupidity that we forget that there are issues and we don't press on this in a consistent way. Yeah.
Michael, am I remembering the end of Stiegler's short book?
Sorry, David, go ahead again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, am I remembering this right? That I think Stiegler ends his like short book, the summary of his work kind of thing, what makes life worth living, with,
Yeah.
I think he ends it by saying that like what makes life worth living is the fight against stupidity. And of course, like
I agree.
Stupidity in that one big book that he like dedicates to it. But that I think he closes his like the summary of his work with that. Like
I think that's very important, and that's a Socratic call in a lot of ways. He is following the long tradition of the Socratic maxim, the unexamined life, the inability to examine life and to question and interrogate, makes life not worth living, right? Yeah. What is our raison d'etre? Yeah, in many ways. Yeah, good point. Yeah, no, he very much comes out of that tradition. And again, he is another one that reads Plato. One of the reasons I know that the Marxist tradition has, officially taken on Aristotle as their patron, right, from the ancient world, the materialist, right, Aristotelian materialism. But I think it's very important for Plato vis-a-vis Badiou and Stiegler in terms of this dialogical form, its richness, and then ultimately the materiality. Yeah, materiality. Why Biden is there, John, to answer your question, and I can do this almost directly, is he represents technological capital going forward. He represents the Eric Schmidts of Google, right? The Michael Bloomberg of Bloomberg Enterprises of the billionaire class, and also Bill Gates. And this is the future of education. We did not go into right now, but what's being planned. And, again, they don't sit around and just say we're going to make people stupid, but what's being planned is this delivery of online remote education brought to you by 3-4 major companies with a lot of little divisions in that. It's just a matter of time before Zoom, which is so overvalued as a corporation for such a simple idea. I mean, today it was up, the entire stock market was down, Zoom was up 10%. You talk about mob psychology, the crowd. Has anybody read Gustave Le Bon, The Crowd? Yeah, very good book. Yeah, good, David. Yeah, very good book. A favorite of Freud's. He cites it in Ego and Mass Psychology, group psychology, and the analysis of the ego. But anyway, the crowd is usually wrong, right, in a way. But you see these tendencies happening, how people really latch on. But yeah, the new moment is really about Google, Apple, of course, Bloomberg and all of this, etc. Right? Yeah. So okay. So and Ghislaine Maxwell, I don't know. She's in prison a few blocks away. I haven't been able to visit her, to get get the black book, so to speak. But anyway, yeah. So good comments, John. It's good to have you here. I hope people see some of it. So anyway, so next week, I don't want to hold you unless there's some comments about this. I know I'm ranting about, I take this very personally as being a teacher a long time. I know Bruno here has been a teacher a long time. David, I know you're Lydia, you all teach. Tony's here who teaches, etc. And Nathan, of course, will. We've really been, shortchanged in many ways. We're really in a very, awkward and difficult position right now because the curriculum, the core that's being offered, unless you're very subtle and very good and you're in an institution that supports this, which are very few, you cannot really get across to the students, right? You're also dealing with, I've noticed this, 20 years ago, this turn that took place 20 years ago, I could have students that could write 20-page papers without direction. But today, forget it. Forget it. So really, you're beginning to see this decline, right, in the intellectual level and engagement. It's very sad in a way. Although I do see this kind of upsurge and this kind of interest that's coming up, right? That's coming up with some of the young people. They're curious. You know, what was killed, Lydia, to go back to what you said, the turn to me is that curiosity was killed. You know, theoretical curiosity was basically defeated in the name of job readiness education, technical education, etc. This
I really,
theoretical curiosity was very much destroyed. Yeah,
I
yeah,
was really asking,
yeah,
just from the perspective of history that I don't have,
yeah.
about the structure of the university, about the boards, about the stacked administration,
Right,
federalization of student loans, the
right.
privatization
1980s.
of student loans. Like a materialist history of philosophy, to me, would have to include
Absolutely.
much more analysis of all of that, you know, aside from cultural dynamics. I'm really asking about the
Right,
economic and the power dynamics of the university and how
right.
that changed, how tenure got broken, because it's broken. I mean, if you've got it, don't die because they won't replace you, right? So
Yeah, like Ruth Ginsburg. Don't die.
yeah, so I don't know how all of that happened. The corporatization,
It happened. It
the
happened in the
client,
1980s.
the client model. I mean, I don't, I guess it's a slow slide, but it seems like there must be specific moments that we could.
Okay, well, I mean, I can give you at least a personal story. In 1973, which I consider kind of a high point of the theoretical left, you know, to my mind, this is telos is going strong. Social text has not been happening yet. Diacritics is underway. 1973-74 is a kind of watershed year. And what happens during that time, you begin to see a shift in student interest, right? In a way. David Geffen, who you probably know, at that time was the head of Elektra Asylum Records, and he authored a course on business in the recording industry at Yale. 300 students show up. They don't go to the literature courses. They go to the business, you know, course of David Geffen, who is now, as you know, is a multi-billionaire and a patron to the arts and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? In a way. To me, this began a kind of shift in the American psyche. By the end of the 70s, instead of having intellectuals on TV, shows where you had, you know, the Chomsky Foucault debates, right? Or you had, you know, guests on Dick Cavett that had something to say, you began to see a kind of the economists going on. The Greenspan thing began right away. So the economics takes over. Reagan is elected, right, etc. And you begin to see this new administrative class that is created to manage the university. It becomes, like you said, a business. It becomes corporatized, right? It was always a business, but presidents of universities began to be appointed on the basis of their legal credentials as lawyers or as business people, not so much as scholars like you used to have with Kingman Brewster, right? Even Clark Kerr in California had an academic background. So you begin to see this shift happening, and now it's so deeply embedded that the administrative staff is greater in certainly in terms of salary and benefits than the teaching faculty. And the administrators do nothing but adhere to, you know, we've got this with Title IX, we've got to do this. They sit around and push pencils all day long. However, they're in power because they've taken over curriculum, you know, the core curriculum, Common Core, all these things are part of administrative policy, no longer faculty control. So over the last, especially this is accelerated the last 20 years, faculty control is diminished more and more and more. You know, it's unconscionable that Nathan has a neo-Kantian teaching him Parmenides. The neo-Kantian should not be at a high-powered program that has its basis, for lack of a better term, continental philosophy at Stony Brook, right? Which has a reputation of being a very advanced place because of Hugh Silverman and others, you know, Edward Casey, et cetera, all first-rate phenomenologists, Don Idy, et cetera, over the years. So we're beginning to see this replacement with an analytical school that is very, very banal, very unimaginative. Here, our friend is bored the second week of class, right? And this is his chosen field. He's bored, right? Reading, Plato's Parmenides. So, yes. So, I mean, I locate this early 70s. There's a turn. You have people like Jameson writes The Prison House of Language, Marxism and Form. Tony Wilton writes System and Structure. All these books are worth revisiting. And Aronowitz's False Promises. To me, this is a high point of the left. You have the labor question, the language question, and then the question of communication and communication theory and revolution. All in 3 books, that are actually setting up, in my opinion, codes for future study. These are taken up by some groups of scholars, but again, you don't have that kind of whirlwind or production in any given time since then, right? And in a way. So this was the outgrowth of something that probably began in the 50s as ideation and reaches its culmination in 73. Since then, yes, there's great commentary. There's some original ideas. Certainly, Mike Davis is great on the West Coast in terms of labor, Prisoners of the American Dream. You have a few great psychoanalytical studies. You have the import culture from the French, right? The French invasion, if you will, post-World War II is Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and Temps Moderne. But then after the 60s, Derrida, Lacan, Foucault, and others, Deleuze, etc., all part of another kind of machinery. That becomes embedded in the academia, but again, it's not grown from within, in a sense, and it doesn't become part and parcel except of an elite culture, in a way. They're not reading Gilles Deleuze at Jackson State in Mississippi, right? Or at the University of Alabama at Huntsville, at Tuscaloosa, in a
Actually, I
certain
think they are, because that's where my
to a
friends
degree.
are.
Yeah, really, they are? Okay.
Right? Come on. I mean, there's so many PhDs. They're teaching Deleuze everywhere now, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, but yeah, but the question is, how much
As an
does it
adjunct,
become part of a culture, right?
right?
In a way, how much does it become part of a culture? Though that's part of the problem. How much is it diluted by the time it hits places like that? Is it really part of the culture? The point I'm trying to make to answer your question in a more materialist way is that in 1973, you have these fundamental shifts in books around questions of labor, linguistics, communication theory, and what would be the revolutionary upsurge, right? In a way, these are really fundamental books that shake up paradigms, right? In many ways, okay, they shake up paradigms completely. Kuhn is discussed in terms of the structure of scientific revolution, maybe another shake up because he's the one that advances, paradigm theory and scientific revolutions. But as you go forward, yes, you have all these imports, and yeah, you're right. I mean, I won't argue with David Willis is at the University of Alabama, where he teaches Derrida, and he's a commentator on Derrida, and very good. But the question is, does it become part of the culture? Does it become part of the culture? And does it become embedded? It's one thing to read and then go on a chat and stuff like that, but does it become part of the everyday culture itself? I mean, this to me is a real question. How does this become part of everyday life? How does it become part of, our everyday, routine? Yes, go ahead. Yeah, Nathan.
Don't you think that like a disaster such as COVID-19, in a way, suddenly introduces a new way of relating to reality? Perhaps a new unconscious is forming because of this, but now this primitive mechanism of the virus, such that a new
You're talking about it as a possibility?
well, as a possibility, but
We're writing this. Bruno's part of the writing.
As a way, it's already happened despite of us. So that the disaster supersedes our consciousness. That that more and more, in a way, we effectively are, in a sense, in mourning of a dead way of life. pre-COVID-19, that is. So that, I mean, this disaster introduces new possibilities for social change, and changes that, you know, they're sort of thrusted in front of us. You know, it's going to change no matter what, whether we're like it or not. And in a way, I think the so-called right-wing populism, they are, you know, they are very dangerous, but in a way they're not all that significant as more of a reaction or a reactive impulse towards such a catastrophic shift.
Look, I mean, I think one thing we have to really recognize is that who controls the clock? This is always the question. Who controls time? To ask that question, right? Going forward. Who controls time and money? Who controls time and leisure? Who controls this, right? In a sense. To ask that question is a radical question. You know, do we really have control over this? Jonathan Crary writes a book called 24/7. What capitalism has done in the final analysis is it's stolen our time. Not only steals and exploits us, but it also takes our money, etc., but it's really now stolen our time. So to me, the question of the virus and the pandemic is how do we experience time differently, right? Again, right? And how do we recapture that time or take that time into the future? You know, or what Bruno and I and Bruno came up with the phrase, how do we take back what was ours? How do we reappropriate? This to me is an essential question going forward. How do you reappropriate? How do you retake what has been taken from you? The mourning, the loss, etc. Yeah? And what are the new possibilities that you speak to, right? Or are we going to be remote digital objects like this? I mean, I love seeing you guys, but I've met some of you. I know some of you in person, but I'm just getting, you know, and it would be much more fruitful for us to be in a classroom because I could diagram the good or the forms for you, and we could have another kind of level of discussion. So we're limited, you know, somewhat here, you know, in some ways. So what is the new that's coming up? Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
See you next time.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. So, I mean, I'm interested in this subject, and it should be part of what we have to, you know, talk about, you know, going forward. You know, yeah. What does this new look like? What is this new world going to be? You know, going forward. I mean, here you are again. You know, instead of being in exciting classes where death is knocking at the door, you know, as Epicurus says, all the walls have come down, right? And you're listening to a neo-Kantian interpretation of Parmenides. I'm sorry to harp on that, but I'm astonished to learn that, you know, you're subjected to such, you know, unimaginative approaches to.
Yeah. I mean, in a very perverse way, the class sort of galvanized me to actually do my own research. And I just started looking up, you know, commentaries on Parmenides that is not by Gilbert Ryle. My God, he actually let us read Gilbert Ryle's reading of Parmenides. It's like a murder. It's like a murder of Plato. It's a violation as well.
It happens.
It's horrendous.
People will do anything to get a job. Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you. Yeah. Anybody else want to contribute? I mean, I don't want to keep you all night. Like, you know me, I can go on. So, you know, too much. Yeah, David. Yeah.
Regarding the changes in academia since the 70s, and like what we're mourning and what we have a chance to sort of change through COVID, a way to connect those. The two concepts of incorporation and proletarianization as trends within those changes in academia, right? The degree of cultural studies emerged in academia in the 70s and 80s with some pretty radical ideas, but universities learned how to incorporate some of those radical ideas.
Absolutely.
Sometimes by giving prominent positions to folks who were prominent in the field, like in a variety of ways, incorporations sort of took place. And It's like the adjunctification and like both like the proletarianization of the faculty through adjunctification and through digitization. I
Yes,
think are
I
important.
agree.
Like if we're thinking about how to use this moment to reverse or to move into a new development out of these kinds of trends, like how to fight against successful moves to incorporate radicals within the university, and what to do about the next move that administrators are making, which is to cut the adjunct population whose like bloat has been used by administrators as an attack against tenured faculty. And now at Rutgers and CUNY as well, they're trying to use COVID to cut into the number of adjuncts that they have teaching,
Right.
while explicitly aiming to speed up the full-time faculty and ask them to take on more courses.
Right.
So as far as looking for opportunities to, I don't know, come out of this crisis in better condition, you know, it looks like we're already setting up to come out of this crisis in even worse condition, is what it looks like.
I kind of agree with you. I think the slogan should be "Occupy the institutions." Occupy the university. It's basically where you show and you demonstrate to the board you can do a fucking better job than all these half-assed idiots, you know, that are administrating, that have no education. You take it over, you mobilize with the students. You know, there is a movement. There's always a movement, right? In a sense. You know, our friend Aronowitz, when he wrote the book How Class Works, class is a movement. It's not a fixed position. You know, I mean, we should have talked about this tonight vis-a-vis Thrasymachus. But anyway, the idea, right? The idea, you know, here is that you have to build movements. You need these kind of connections and fusions to go forward. So this becomes, to me, essential. To occupy the institution. The problem with faculty, again, they're usually petite bourgeois. Yeah, in a way. I mean, the interesting thing, the adjuncts are willing to take more risks because the tenured faculty are petite bourgeois trying to protect their security. And this is another thing too, right? Yeah. You're right. How power works. That's good. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's really the only way out in a way, because the reformist movement, you're going to get this little thing in the curriculum, etc. I think if we don't think revolution, and I'm not talking about basically storming the White House and this kind of stuff, you know, the movie version, but I mean, I'm talking about revolutionary praxis where you take the risks of occupying something with a carefully thought out, you know, plan, right? And you work with that as much as you can. You might bring some attention. Yeah, you might you might bring some attention. And you know, and again, why not? You know, I mean, I know how to administer an institution. I'm not a technically trained Harvard Business School person, but I know the dynamics of how an institution works. You know, as a faculty member, I can certainly put together scheduling, courses, work with the technicians for the technology in the room, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I've got more clout with buildings and grounds than anybody on the LIU campus. They love me because I'm the only one that stood up to the president, right? I mean, in a way, or to the administration. So in a sense, yeah, you could do this at selected places. I don't know Rutgers, but Rutgers has a pretty advanced faculty. You've got people like your advisor. I mean, Jack, right? Is Jack your advisor still? Yeah, okay. And Michael McKeon in English, who wrote a very good book on domesticating the domestication and labor, right, from a Marxist perspective in literature. He's very smart. His father is actually the Aristotelian Richard McKeon from the University of Chicago, who, worse than neo-Kantians, Nathan, but anyway, he turned out okay. But anyway, all to say, I think, yeah, again, if you can kind of think about Occupy, and how do you really work with the students on this? Because if you have the students, then you have power. If you don't have the students, you don't have really much power. They're just going to say a bunch of spoiled brats, these faculty members. That's the way they see you. Lazy, they come in, all they care about is Tuesday, Thursday schedules. That's the way you're constituted as a faculty member. All they give a shit about is your Tuesday, Thursday schedule. Yeah, yeah. They spend 10 hours a week on campus or 10 hours a week remote, and we pay them 80 to 120,000 depending on institution, rank, etc., and in some cases more.
And even, I mean, leadership at Rutgers has articulated adjuncts even as like a lower class. It's not even that like we're lazy. It's that like, it's not that we're successful and lazy. It's that we're not successful and underpaid because we're lazy. And if like we don't want to be adjuncts, then we should work harder and not be.
This is ridiculous.
Exactly.
First of all, how can an adjunct publish if the adjunct doesn't get time off? Most adjuncts have to teach 5 to 6 courses, to make a living and then to publish, right? To work within those frameworks. A full-time faculty member on a tenure track job actually gets 1 year to do their research, to put their portfolio together off from the teaching responsibilities. So first of all, the game is completely fixed in terms, to paraphrase, Leonard Cohen, everybody knows the dice is loaded, right? In a way. For those kind of comments to come out of faculty members' mouth is absolute stupidity. You would expect that out of Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell, or, Mitch McConnell's wonderful wife, Elaine Chao, right, or whatever. Yeah, anyway. Yeah.
More from him, but the Chancellor of New Brunswick actually said it to the press 2 years ago.
Right. There you go. And they'll repeat faculty. That's another thing, too, that they'll use anything in their way. And this is, again, how these people use power versus the left, who doesn't really know how to use the power, right, in a sense. Because there's something Machiavellian that's missing here that Gramsci really knew, right? The Modern Prince is a great book in terms of understanding. Machiavelli's Prince is a great book. The Art of War. These things need to be studied. We're in a war. I mean, it's not nice, but we're in a war. I mean, this is not peacetime. This is not, kumbaya time. It's not about the unity of justice entering, with all due respect to Plato's notion of harmony, we're in dissonance, part 5 now. We're post Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, Steve Reich, Pauline Oliveras, in terms of dissonance, right? That's what's happening constantly, right? Justice is a kind of dissonance. Justice in a way, to Adorno, and we talk about this as we go on, is the antithetical. To put yourself in the position of the antagonistic dialectic, the antithetical. I think that makes for very clear thinking, to take that step into not synthetic dialectic or ground where there's, movement coming together, right? I think it's much more important to see this as a structural antagonism, and you have to work from that position, right? This is one of the reasons I personally have affinity to people like Negre, some Badiou in a different way. He's working out of and certainly the Frankfurt School, which I still think are, worth reading and worth thinking. Again, as I recommended, Juliet, Enlightenment or Morality is a text that is so resonant today, to my mind. This is 1944 they write this. And I was thinking of doing a course on Babylon, Berlin. I don't know if anyone's seen the Netflix. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, right, Nathan? Yeah, it's pretty good. He likes it. Anyway, I would do a course called The 30s Are Before Us. Weimar Germany is before us, right, in a way. Yeah. And we're really thinking this way. It's more sophisticated in terms of capital flows and some of the problems we're facing, but at the same time, we're fundamentally, that's where we are, right? Right? Fundamentally, yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah. And the exercises are enormous, right? And in a way, if we could have collaborative, interpretive communities like we try to form here, right, with issues on the table, etc., readings of books, etc., the more powerful these become, the better off we are. This is what we really need, in a way, is this kind of, collaboration. and also sharing of what's happening in our respective classrooms, our respective social engagements and social relations. I think this becomes very, very important as we go forward, right? It's going to get worse, folks. I mean, I hate to say it, it just looks like it's going to get worse. I mean, unfortunately, Stiegler, Marcuse, and others really pinpoint this in a way. I don't see where the turnaround is happening. I mean, I hope Lydia has some optimism in terms of what she's seeing out there.
Well,
But
I
yeah,
basically
yeah,
so where I see the potential is all in Black radical movements,
okay,
education, um,
I agree
establishing
with you. Yeah,
alternative schools. I mean, all of that is so productive, and we've
yeah,
talked about this before. You and I don't quite see eye to eye on that, but I see this as incredibly intellectually rich, anti-capitalist, sophisticated understandings about cultural, social dynamics, all the way down and through the lens of race and genocide in this country. And I don't see actually a way forward except through that. I don't see any psychoanalysis moving forward except through that. I don't see any feminism or anti-patriarchy moving forward except through that.
okay. No, I hear you. I mean, Jeremy's not here today, but he wrote a very good book on the making of the Black radical tragic, and he's very much in that moment. The question I would have is, I'm friends with Adolf Reed, and Adolf Reed's being chastised because he's bringing up the class question about all of this too. And I think if you eliminate class from the discussion, it's going to be a problem. If it
Not
always were
eliminated.
to,
It's not
I'm sorry,
eliminated at all. And
it's
so
not okay.
I don't yeah, this is nonsensical to me. And it's also it's nonsensical to me that certain elements of the radical left are targeting racial analyses for insufficient critique of capitalism. This is nonsense, as far as I can tell. So yeah, and this is another example of the left eating itself for curious reasons, and the competition in the academy. It predates the 80s. So yeah, we've got to work through our shit better and stop attacking each other. And
No, I agree with you there. Yeah, yeah.
I don't have the same reactions to cancel culture that you do. Sometimes
Okay.
I think that there's an immaturity and an inexperience with aggression, with the tolerance of difficult feelings, that's the origin of cancel culture. And that immaturity is directly related to Stiegler. All the analysis of digitization and consumerism were regressed and or stupid because we've been consumers for too long. We've been consumers for too many generations now.
Right.
As our method of production. If our method of production is consuming, we will be impaled as stuffed pigs and roasted, right? There's nothing else for it. So the hope that I see is in, like I'm saying, Black Lives Matter movement and its connections to carceral culture and the apparatuses of state. So I feel that it's sophisticated. I see it happening in the volunteerism of the new generations of students, in the community activism and the local cultural, the local interface, awareness of local versus and global. There's just so many creative things that students are doing. And they have, as far as I can tell, radicals as their mentors. So maybe it's just where I'm hanging out.
No, it's okay. I mean, I go to Fort Greene. They have a lending library. One's a student of Fred Moten from NYU, and they have put out a People's Library in the in Fort Greene Park and other parks around New York City. So I mean, I see a lot of these people. You know, these are people 25, 28 years old. You know, that are either graduate students, very active, etc. I mean, again, the question is, what is the political organization that would change things? You know, this to me becomes a question. How does insurgency work with organization? And on what principles are those organizations built? And I hear you. I mean, I understand this very well. I see it in my own class. My CUNY, I teach a special course on the sociology of sport. And they're all radicals. I mean, in the classroom, the way they talk, etc. It's very interesting to me. Very different than my usual LIU students, right, in a way, who are there for pharmacy school and technical stuff. And, you know, they have great ideas and all of this, etc. But to my mind, they seem to not really have a place to go. You know, this is the thing. This is my thing on this, you know. I mean, I agree with you. I would like nothing better to see before my dying day, to see really a true upsurge that's going to overturn this. You know, this is the greatest ideological barbarism I've ever seen. How this has been created is unbelievable to me. This is much worse than the Nazi regime, etc., because it's in your face as, you know, nice, friendly fascism in a way, but it's so ugly at another level in terms of the development of the human being and how it treats the human being in some ways. So to me, the stakes are enormous going forward. You know, this is a very different kind of situation of which we don't have the direct day-to-day violence. We have parts of that, but we don't have it like it was in Germany in the late 20s, early 30s, or Italy in the 20s when Gramsci is arrested, etc., or in other countries. But we have it so much underneath the surface in all the policies and everything that goes on. You know, that we live in a country, 40 million people, you know, that are without health care. You know, another 70 million that probably don't have adequate health care or adequate information of how to be healthy. You know, all of these things to me are the product of the worst kind of systematization, moronization going on. And yes, I agree with you, race, and I agree with Du Bois and Lenin on this matter. Race has been the major question in the United States. This has a very long history. It's not something new that just came up in the debate between Adolph Reed and Black Lives Matter or whatever. This has a very long history in the history of theory and materiality in the United States. Again, the question to me is, where's the political organization? We don't have a party formation. We don't have an ongoing. I mean, we have these kind of things, which is great to me, and I'm certainly willing to devote enormous amounts of energy to this, whatever I can give and whatever I can do in a reciprocal way. But we don't have sites. We don't have organization. You know, the Communist Party in the 1950s that I mentioned, they had a building on 23rd Street. They had the Jefferson School next to Red Square. Union Square used to be called Red Square. Now it's a farmer's market, right? Right. I mean, I'm not knocking the farmer's market. I go on occasion, but really, in a way, think about this. What do we really have, you know, in this sense? And you're right. I mean, look, I know that people at, maybe at Jackson State, Howard University, Fisk University, teaching Deleuze, Derrida, you know, Foucault, opening minds, etc. But again, what does that translate to in terms of political transformation? I mean, we're facing basically a jobless future in many ways. David speaking about the continuing adjunctification of the academy. Lydia, you mentioned the assault on tenure. I think tenure's finished at most institutions. It'll remain at the elite institutions, but not at the secondary and tertiary educational institutions, etc. So where are we fighting? In a sense, in a way, this is really it. Where do we have to go? So, I mean, for me, and I've said this for a long time, I mean, my own way, you know, and I don't have that, possibility, but I've talked to people on the left that the main thing we need is a building. We need a site where people can go. Better than the People's Forum, which is in Midtown, which has all kinds of ideological overlay to that. I mean, I know some of this very well. We need a site where we can go. We need a community. We need what Plato's talking about. You know, there are very few people in that political community in Plato's time. We need a formation where we can cook together, where we can drink together, we can discuss. Lydia and I can have debates about race and class, you know, over a good bottle of wine. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I said as long as you're doing the dishes, that's fine.
I know how to do dishes. I learned that very early on.
Some of these
I have many dominant girlfriends. Yeah.
Some of these young people are gathering in collectives, as you were describing, through environmental radicalism and sustainable farming. So sustainable agriculture and the environmental movement is helping people get off the grid. People
I hope so.
Learning how to do this, and they're starting collectives that are reading collectives. So so yeah, let's do it.
All right, I'm with you. Yeah. I just live in New York City. I need a place I can go. I don't want to go. I spend too much time in the Catskills during the summer trying to get into Montreal. I'm tired of the Catskills. Yeah.
Sounds like we need a realtor.
Okay, I hear you. Okay, yes, we need a realtor. Okay, thank you so much. So next week, I live in Fort Greene, John. I'm in the elite neighborhood. You know, very gentrification. Yeah. So anyway, I'm lucky I have rent quote semi-stabilized to be able to continue to live in this luxury land of the park and good subway connections. So anyway, so for next week, I'll put out again. Go to the website; it's available, and I'll do commentary as well as the readings will be there, and I'll try to adhere as much to the thematics that we have. But please bring the questions, right? In a sense, and this would really be good to enhance the level of the discussions and anything else too of what you have a critique of. But again, I think this will stimulate all the issues that we're bringing up. I mean, Badiou covers the waterfront in his reading and his rewriting of Plato. I know we're just getting started, and I know it's colloquial, but it goes in a different level as we get further into it. You know, he's a very sophisticated philosopher. Yeah, in many ways. Okay, so thank you. Anybody else? And then I'll sign off. And bye, Megan. Nice to see you. I'm glad we got to see you. Yeah, good. Okay, thank you again. Okay, David, great intervention. Edwin, yeah, and Nathan, good. Nathan, don't let the Kant class get you down.
Try not to. Thank you.
Read the Heidegger on Parmenides. It's very good. Yeah, even though he has right-wing conservative revolution activities, is a very smart person and very imaginative in his thinking.
Yeah, a lot of good philosophers, they are either right-wing or reactionary.
Philosophy. Most people go into philosophy so they can control people.
Okay.
I'm serious. I'm serious about this.
Okay.
That's why most people choose philosophy as a career. It gives them control over people.
Wow.